I arrived in Hollow Creek just after midnight, when the town looked like it was holding its breath. The road in was narrow and lined with tall trees that blocked the moonlight, making the whole place feel like it was hidden from the rest of the world. The sign for the motel was old and faded, the kind that you could barely read unless you stood close enough to touch it. I remember thinking, this is the kind of place where people disappear without anyone noticing. My car's headlights cut through the dark as I pulled into the parking lot. There were only a few cars there, all of them older models, like the owners had been driving them for years without ever thinking about replacing them. The motel itself looked normal at first glance. A long, low building with rooms lined up like teeth. The paint was chipped, the windows were dusty, and the neon vacancy sign buzzed softly, like it was tired of being on. I stepped out of the car and felt the cold air settle into my skin. It was quiet in a way that made my ears ring. Not just quiet like a deserted place, but quiet like the world had gone mute. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is pressing down on you from above. I stood there for a moment, listening to nothing, and felt a small, unexpected fear rise in my chest. Inside, the motel lobby was dimly lit. The carpet was old and stained, the kind of stains you don't notice until you've been staring at them for a while. A small desk sat in the middle of the room, and behind it was the front counter. There was a bell on the counter, the kind you ring to get someone's attention, but there was no one there to ring it for. I set my bag down and waited. The air smelled like dust and old coffee. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from a back room, but there was no sound. No footsteps, no creaking, nothing. Just the quiet, heavy silence that seemed to be sitting in every corner of the lobby. After a few minutes, I found the office door slightly open. I pushed it and stepped inside. The room was small, filled with paperwork and old guest logs. A single lamp on the desk cast a warm glow, but it didn't make the room feel welcoming. It felt like the light was only there to show me the details I wasn't supposed to see. I sat at the desk and turned on the computer. The screen flickered to life, and I felt a strange sense of relief. At least something was working. The motel's system was old but functional. I began checking the guest list, making sure everything was in order. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were gaps in the list. Not just empty rooms, real gaps like names had been erased. Rooms that had been occupied, but the names were missing. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the previous night manager had simply forgotten to enter them. But the pattern didn't feel accidental. The missing names were always in the same area of the list, as if someone had carefully removed them. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. The silence in the motel suddenly felt louder, like it was waiting for me to notice. I told myself I was overthinking it. I had just moved to a new town, started a new job, and my mind was looking for reasons to feel uneasy. I stood up and walked toward the lobby, trying to shake the feeling. The air was still heavy, still quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the sound of that buzzing made me feel strangely aware of my own breathing. I tried to focus on something normal, anything normal, like the smell of the carpet or the pattern on the wallpaper. But everything felt too still, too perfect in its silence. As I walked down the hallway toward the rooms, I noticed that the doors were all closed. Some of them had curtains drawn, others had a faint light shining through the cracks, but there was no sound behind any of them. No television, no voices, no movement. Just the quiet, like the people inside were holding their breath too. I stopped in front of room 7. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint smell of something sweet drifted out. It reminded me of candy, but also something older, like perfume that had been left on a shelf for years. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was neat. The bed was made, the towels were folded, and the television was off. It looked like someone had been there recently, but there was no sign of anyone now. I walked to the window and looked out. The parking lot was empty except for my car. No one else was there. I turned around and noticed something on the nightstand. A small notebook, open to a page with handwriting that looked hurried. I walked closer and read the words. "They keep the town quiet, don't listen." My heart started beating faster. I felt a chill run down my spine. I closed the notebook and put it back on the nightstand, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. But the handwriting looked too real, too personal. I left the room and shut the door gently behind me. The hallway felt different now, like the walls had moved closer. I walked back to the lobby, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The silence felt like it was watching me. Back at the desk, I sat down and tried to focus on the job. I opened the guest list again, hoping to see something that would explain the missing names. Instead, I noticed something else. A handwritten note taped to the side of the desk. It read, "If you hear the whispering, don't answer." My hands shook slightly as I read it. I didn't remember seeing that note when I first arrived. I didn't remember anyone telling me about any rules, and I certainly didn't remember anyone leaving warnings. I looked around the lobby again. The bell sat on the counter, still silent. The carpet still smelled like old coffee. The air still felt heavy. The town outside still seemed to be holding its breath. I sat there for a long time, listening to nothing. Eventually, I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, like someone whispering from far away. I froze, my ears straining to catch the words. The sound didn't get louder, but it didn't disappear either. It stayed there, just beyond the edge of hearing, like a voice trying to reach me through the walls. I told myself it was just the building settling. Old motels make noises, but the whispering felt too deliberate, too close. I stood up and walked to the front door. The glass was dark, reflecting my own face back at me. I looked at myself for a moment, and I felt the weight of the town's silence pressing down on me. I opened the door and stepped outside, just to breathe. The night air was cold, and the trees around the motel swayed gently in the wind. But the wind didn't make any sound. There was no rustling of leaves, no whisper of movement. The silence outside matched the silence inside, like the whole town had been sealed shut. I stood there for a while, watching the empty road. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of a streetlight, but no cars passed by. No people walked. No animals moved. It was as if Hollow Creek had been frozen in time. When I finally went back inside, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The motel's sign outside was blinking. Not the vacancy sign, but the motel's name itself. The letters flickered, one by one, as if someone was trying to spell something. Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek. But the way the sign blinked made the name feel wrong. Like it wasn't a name at all, but a warning. I returned to the desk and sat down again, trying to calm myself. I told myself I was tired, that I was imagining things, that it was just a new job and a new town, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the quiet stayed, and the town, with its held breath, seemed to be waiting for me to understand something I couldn't yet name. I hadn't slept much since I started working the night shift at the Hollow Creek Motel. The first night had left a kind of pressure in my head, like I'd walked through a heavy fog and still couldn't find the way out. I kept thinking about the gaps in the guest list, the whispered warning taped to the desk, and the way the town outside felt like it was holding its breath. So when the clock hit midnight again, I was already tired in a way that didn't feel like normal tired. It was deeper. It felt like my body had been carrying something heavy for a long time. I was behind the desk, staring at the computer screen, trying to keep my eyes open. The glow from the monitor was the only light in the lobby, aside from the soft buzz of the neon vacancy sign outside. The air smelled like dust and old carpet. Everything felt still. Then the bell on the counter rang. It was a slow, clear sound, like someone tapping the edge of a glass. The kind of sound that makes you jump, even when you know it's coming. I stood up quickly, my heart beating hard. I wasn't expecting anyone. No cars had passed the motel in hours. No one had checked in since I arrived. I walked to the front door and opened it. A man stood there, his face half hidden in the shadow of his hood. He looked like he had been driving for a long time. His eyes were tired, but not in a normal way. They looked like someone who had been awake for days, like he had been waiting for something that never came. He didn't smile. He didn't look relieved to be inside. He just stood there, breathing slowly, like he was trying not to make any noise. "Room?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was a strange weight to it. It didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a request that had been repeated many times before. "Yes," I said. "We have rooms. What name should I put on the registration?" He hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small envelope. He slid it across the counter toward me. Inside was cash, a thick stack of bills, all in small denominations. It wasn't the usual way people paid. Most people used cards, even in small towns, but he had cash, and he placed it on the counter with a steady hand. "I'll pay," he said, "but I need a specific room." "Which one?" I asked. He looked at me as if he didn't like the question. He leaned forward slightly, and I noticed that his hands were shaking just a little. "The room that isn't there," he said softly. I blinked, not sure if I heard him correctly. The words sounded strange, like something someone would say when they were joking, but his face didn't show any hint of humor. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there are only 10 rooms. They're all numbered. There's no room that isn't there." He stared at me for a moment, and I felt a chill run through my body. It wasn't the cold. It was the feeling that he was looking through me, like he could see something I couldn't see. "The room that isn't there," he repeated. "The one that doesn't show up on the map." I swallowed. I didn't like the way he said it. I didn't like the way his eyes seemed to be searching for something behind me. "Okay," I said slowly. "What name should I put on the registration?" He paused again. Then he said, "You don't need a name." I frowned. Everyone needs a name, that's the rule. He leaned closer, and I could smell something on him. It smelled like metal and old wood, like a basement. "I don't have a name," he said, "and I don't want one. I just want the room that isn't there." My hands were shaking slightly now. I tried to force my voice to sound normal. "Sir, I can't give you a room without a name. It's the policy." He nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer. Then he said, "Then you'll do it anyway." I stared at him, not sure if he was threatening me or simply stating a fact. The silence in the lobby felt heavier than ever. The neon sign outside buzzed softly, and I felt like I was being watched. "I can't," I said again, trying to sound firm. He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He simply looked down at the cash on the counter, then back at me. "You can," he said. "You already did." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He pointed toward the computer screen. "Look." My heart skipped. I turned to the screen, and there it was, the guest list, the list I had been studying for hours, the list with the gaps, the list with the missing names. But now there was something else. A new entry had appeared. No name, no room number, just a blank line with the word "reserved" written next to it in all caps. I didn't remember typing it. I didn't remember seeing it before. "Did you put that there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "No, I didn't touch your computer." I looked back at him, and for the first time I noticed something else. The man's eyes were not tired. They were empty, like someone had taken the life out of them and left only the shape behind. I felt my throat tighten. I tried to force myself to stay calm. "Okay," I said slowly. "Let's just do this the normal way. I need a name and I need a room number." He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that looked like it had been practiced. "My name is," he said, and then he paused. His smile faded. He looked down at his hands again, like he was trying to remember something. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," I said, feeling a sudden anger rise in me. "I can't check you in without it." He looked up at me again, and his expression softened, almost pitying. "You're new," he said. "You don't understand how this place works." I swallowed hard. "I understand it's a motel. People check in, people check out." He nodded slowly. "Yes, people check in, people check out, but some people never leave." The words hit me like a cold splash of water. I felt my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned closer again, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "The room that isn't there," he said. "That room is for people who don't want to be found, people who are already gone." My heart pounded. I tried to step back, but my feet felt stuck to the floor. "What are you talking about?" I asked, but I could tell my voice sounded shaky. He sighed, like he was tired of repeating himself. "You'll understand," he said. "You already have, you just haven't admitted it." I stared at him, and for a moment I saw something in his face that didn't belong there. A memory, a fear, a part of him that was still human. He looked at the motel hallway behind me, and I followed his gaze. The doors were closed, the lights were dim, everything looked normal. But I felt the same strange feeling I had felt on my first night. Like the building was holding something in, like it was hiding something behind its walls. I looked back at the man and I asked, Are you a guest here?" He shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm a visitor." I didn't understand what he meant, but I felt the dread growing in my chest, slow and steady, like something creeping up from behind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. It was old, heavy, and it looked like it had been used for years. He placed it on the counter. "This is the key," he said. "The key to the room that isn't there." I stared at it, my hands trembled. "That's not one of our keys," I said. He shrugged. "It doesn't have to be." I looked at him again and I noticed something else. The man's clothes were clean, but they looked old, like they belonged to another time, like he had stepped out of a different decade and into mine. He reached for the cash again and picked it up. He counted it slowly, one bill at a time, like he was making sure the money was still real. Then he looked at me and said, "You're going to regret this." I felt a cold wave run through me. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the lobby as if he was listening for something. And then very softly, I heard it. A whisper. Not loud, not clear, just a faint sound like someone speaking from the other side of a wall. The man's eyes widened. He looked at me with a strange expression, a mixture of fear and relief. "They're here," he whispered. My heart slammed in my chest. I looked toward the hallway, but the doors were still closed. The air still smelled like dust. The lights still buzzed softly. But the whisper came again, closer this time. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the meaning. It was like someone calling my name from far away. The man leaned forward and said, "Don't answer them." I didn't know what to do. I felt frozen. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He looked at me one last time, and his voice turned almost gentle. "Just do what you always do," he said. "Pretend you don't hear anything." Then he turned and walked into the hallway. I watched him go, my mind racing. The whispering grew louder, and I realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that it wasn't coming from outside the motel. It was coming from inside, and it was getting closer. I stood there behind the counter, my hands shaking, staring at the empty hallway. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, as if it was the only thing in the world that still moved. I didn't know who the man was. I didn't know what he meant by the room that wasn't there, but I knew one thing for sure. The silence in Hollow Creek wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. I tried, I really did. But the moment I closed my eyes, the motel's silence seemed to press against my skull. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt like something watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. So I stayed up. I stayed at the desk, staring at the computer screen, trying to keep my mind busy. I kept checking the guest list, looking for the missing names again. I kept looking at the note taped to the desk that said, "If you hear the whispering, don't answer." The whispering came back at some point, but it was far away, like it was traveling through the walls. I couldn't make out any words. I just felt the sound, like a distant voice trying to push through. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but the whispering didn't sound like a building. It sounded like someone speaking softly, someone trying to reach me. When the night finally began to feel like it was stretching longer than it should, I decided to do something I probably shouldn't have done. I went to the storage room. The storage room was small and cramped, filled with old supplies and boxes. It smelled like dust and old wood. The lights were dim, and the air felt heavier than the lobby. I had never really been in there before, except to grab cleaning supplies or extra towels. But that night, something about the room called to me, not in a loud way, in a quiet way, like a thought that keeps coming back no matter how hard you try to push it away. I opened the door and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my feet and the sound echoed in the small room. I looked around, scanning the shelves and boxes. There were towels, cleaning supplies, extra bedding, and a few old pieces of furniture. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed the back wall. It looked different from the rest of the room. The paint was newer, the wood seemed fresher, and there was a faint line where the wall met the floor. It looked like something had been built over, like the room had been changed at some point. I walked closer, my heart beating faster. I ran my fingers along the wall and I felt a small, almost invisible seam. A door. I stared at it for a moment, my mind trying to make sense of it. There had never been a door there before. I was sure of it. I had been in this room so many times and I would have noticed. I pressed my hand against the seam. The wall was cold. The seam was slightly raised like the edge of a hidden door. I pushed gently. The wall didn't move. I pressed harder. Still nothing. Then I noticed a small keyhole near the seam. It was old, rusted, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I stared at the keyhole, and I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. The key the man had left on the counter flashed in my mind. The one he said was for the room that wasn't there. I reached into my pocket and touched the key. It was still there. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't thrown it away. I hadn't even looked at it since he left. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled the key out and held it up to the light. It fit. I didn't know why I tried it. I didn't know why I expected it to work. But the moment I inserted it into the keyhole, I felt a strange sense of certainty, like this was something that had been waiting for me. I turned the key. The lock clicked. The seam in the wall shifted slightly, and the hidden door opened. A cold breeze rushed out, carrying the smell of old paper and dust. The air inside the corridor was colder than the storage room. It felt like stepping into a different place entirely. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness. The corridor was narrow, and the walls were lined with old wallpaper that had faded over time. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, like no one had walked there in years. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The sound echoed down the corridor, and I suddenly felt very alone. The corridor was lit by a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light flickered slightly, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing softly. As I moved deeper into the corridor, I noticed something on the walls. Old photographs. They were taped to the wallpaper, scattered along the corridor like a strange gallery. I walked closer to one of them and saw that it was a picture of a family. A mother, a father, and a child standing in front of the motel. The photo looked old, like it had been taken decades ago. The family was smiling, but their eyes looked tired. I looked at another photo. This one was of a man standing in the motel lobby. He looked familiar. Not because I knew him, but because his face seemed to be the same as the man who had checked in earlier. The same tired eyes, the same empty expression. I felt a chill run through me. I kept walking and the photos kept appearing. Couples, families, travelers. Some of them were smiling. Some of them looked frightened. Some of them looked like they were trying to disappear. I reached a small table against the wall. On the table was a stack of old guest records. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was clear. The names were written in neat rows with room numbers and dates. I picked up the top record and began to read. The names were familiar. Not because I knew the people, but because I had seen their names on the guest list earlier. The same names that were missing now. The names that had gaps beside them. The names that had no checkout date. I flipped through the records and my stomach turned. There were names that had been written over and over again, as if someone had tried to erase them and failed. There were names that were crossed out, then written again, then crossed out again. There were names with no room number, just a blank space. And then I saw it. A name that made my hands go cold. My own name. It was written in neat handwriting with a room number beside it. The date was today's date. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. My mind tried to reject it. It tried to tell me it was a mistake, a prank, a coincidence. But the handwriting was too familiar. It looked like my own handwriting, only cleaner, like someone had studied it and copied it. I felt the walls closing in. I put the record down, my hands shaking. I looked around the corridor and I realized that the photos were not just pictures. They were like evidence, like a record of everyone who had ever stayed here. I walked further down the corridor and I saw a door at the end. The door was old with peeling paint. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. On the door was a small sign. Room 11. I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of dread and curiosity. The motel only had 10 rooms, I knew that. I had counted them myself. There was no room 11. But there it was, written on the door like it had always been there. My heart pounded. I walked closer and the air grew colder. I could feel the temperature dropping like I was walking into a freezer. The wallpaper seemed to fade and the dust on the floor became thicker. I reached for the doorknob. My hand hovered over it, trembling. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was inside, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned the knob. The door opened. Inside was another small corridor, even darker than the first. The air smelled like old paper and rust. The walls were lined with more photos, more records, more evidence of people who had stayed here. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me. The sound of the lock clicking shut was loud in the quiet corridor. I turned around, but the door was already sealed. There was no way out. I felt a panic rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself that the door would open again, that it was just a normal door, and I had just stepped into a part of the motel that no one used anymore. But the corridor felt wrong. The air felt heavier. The shadows seemed to move closer. I walked forward, my footsteps echoing. I looked at the photos on the walls and I realized something. All the faces in the pictures were looking at me. Not in a normal way, not like a person in a photo looking at a camera, but like they were aware, like they were watching me from the past. I stopped in front of a photo and stared. It was a picture of the motel lobby, the same lobby I had been sitting in just minutes ago. But the photo was old and the lobby looked different. The furniture was older, the carpet was different, and the desk looked worn. But the man behind the desk in the photo was me. I felt my breath catch. I looked closer, and I saw something that made my skin crawl. In the photo, I was sitting at the desk, staring at the computer screen, the same way I was sitting now, the same way I had been sitting earlier. And behind me in the hallway, there was a shadow. a shape that looked like a person standing just out of sight. I looked away from the photo, my heart pounding. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the walls. I didn't know how long I tried to convince myself that I was dreaming. I didn't know how long I waited for the door to open. But eventually, I heard a sound. A soft, slow sound. Like someone walking. Not in the hallway behind me, but inside the corridor itself, coming closer. I turned my head, and I saw the shadow move. Not fast, not in a hurry, just slowly, like someone taking their time. And I realized, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that the corridor wasn't sealed by accident. It was sealed on purpose. And whatever was inside, it wasn't meant to be found. I backed away from the wall, my hands shaking. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I could feel the sweat on my skin. The whispering came again, closer this time. And I knew in that moment that the motel wasn't just a place people stayed. It was a place that kept them. And now I was trapped inside its hidden history. I don't know why I kept going back to the guest list. I think it was because my mind needed something simple to focus on, something that felt normal. The motel was full of strange things. The hidden corridor, the photos, the whispering, the feeling that the walls were watching me. But the guest list felt like a piece of ordinary life. So I kept looking at it, hoping it would make sense. The next morning, or what I thought was morning, the sun didn't come. The sky stayed dark and gray, like the world had decided to stop moving. The motel lights stayed on, buzzing softly. The neon sign outside continued to flicker, and the air still smelled like dust and old carpet. I was tired. I was exhausted in a way that didn't feel physical. It felt like my brain had been running for days, but I couldn't sleep. Not after what I had seen in the hidden corridor. Not after seeing my own name on the guest records. I sat at the desk and opened the guest list again. I tried to focus on the names, the room numbers, the dates. I tried to treat it like a normal task, but my eyes kept drifting to the gaps, the missing names, the empty spaces. I had noticed them before, but now they felt different, like they were staring back at me. I scrolled through the list slowly, trying to find something that would explain it, something that would make sense. But the more I looked, the more I realized that the gaps were not random. They were organized. They were placed in specific patterns, like someone had intentionally removed certain names, certain people, certain nights. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. I felt a headache forming, but I forced myself to keep looking. I needed to understand. Then I heard a sound. The drawer behind the counter opened. I turned my head slowly, my heart beating faster. The drawer was where the room keys were kept. It was a small, wooden drawer with a simple lock. I had never opened it without needing a key. It was always closed, always locked. But now it was open. The keys inside were still there, lined up on the hooks. Each one had a tag with a room number. Some of them had names written on the tags. Most of them did. But there were a few keys with no names, just room numbers. I stood up slowly and walked toward the drawer. My hands were shaking. I reached inside and pulled out one of the keys. It was for room 7, the room I had entered the first night. The tag had a name on it, but it was faded, like it had been written a long time ago. I couldn't read it clearly. I set the key back and pulled out another one. Room 3. The tag was blank. No name, no date, just the number. I looked at the other keys. There were several like that. Room numbers with blank tags. Keys that were still in the drawer as if someone had forgotten to assign them, or as if someone had taken the names away. I felt a cold wave run through me. If these keys belonged to guests, then where were the names? Why were they missing? And why were the keys still here waiting? I pulled out more keys, one by one, and examined the tags. Some had names that I recognized, names that had been on the guest list. Names that had check-in dates and check-out dates. Names that looked normal. But the blank ones were the ones that made my stomach twist. I thought about the man who had checked in the night before, the man who had asked for the room that wasn't there, the man who had left the key on the counter, the man whose eyes looked empty. I wondered if his key was one of the blank ones. I looked at the drawer again, and my eyes caught something I hadn't noticed before. A small, folded piece of paper tucked behind the keys. I pulled it out carefully. The paper was old, yellowed, and torn at the edges. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I unfolded it slowly. It was a list. Not a guest list, not a list of names, just a list of numbers, room numbers. But there was something strange about it. The numbers were not in order. They were scattered like someone had written them down as they remembered them. And next to each number was a small symbol, a mark, a small line or a circle or a dot. I stared at the list, trying to understand what it meant. Then I noticed something else. Some of the room numbers on the paper were not rooms in the motel. Room 11, room 13, room 14. There were numbers that didn't exist. I felt my hands go cold. I looked at the keys again, and I realized that there were keys for rooms that didn't exist too. I had never noticed them before because I had assumed the motel only had 10 rooms. But there were more. I pulled out a key with the number 11 on it. The tag was blank. The metal was cold in my hand. The key looked old, like it had been used for a long time. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what it meant. I set the key down carefully and closed the drawer. I sat back down at the desk, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just an old motel. Maybe the building had been larger once, and the extra rooms had been closed off. Maybe the keys were leftovers from a time when the motel was bigger. But the thought didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse. Because the motel didn't feel like a normal place. It felt like a place that had been changed, like someone had taken parts of it away. I looked at the guest list again. I looked at the missing names. I looked at the blank tags. I looked at the list of room numbers that didn't exist. And I realized something that made my stomach drop. The missing names were not just missing. They were erased. Like someone had taken a pen and scratched them out, leaving behind only the faint shadow of the letters. I leaned forward and zoomed in on the guest list, trying to see the faint marks. The names were there, but they were faint, like someone had tried to remove them but couldn't completely erase them. I stared at the list for a long time, my mind trying to understand. Then I noticed something else. The names that were missing were all from the same time period. The same week. The same month. The same year. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. It was like the motel had been running a specific pattern, like it had been collecting certain people, then removing them from the records as if they had never existed. I thought about the warning note taped to the desk. If you hear the whispering, don't answer. I thought about the hidden corridor, filled with photos and records. I thought about the man who had asked for the room that wasn't there. And I realized that the motel was not just hiding something. It was hiding people. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the guest list. I didn't know how long I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I didn't know how long I waited for something to happen. But eventually, I heard a sound. A soft click, like a key turning in a lock. I froze. The sound came from the hallway behind me. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just sat there listening. The click happened again, louder this time. And then very slowly, I heard footsteps. Not fast, not running, just slow, steady steps moving toward the lobby. I felt my heart pounding. I felt my hands shaking. I wanted to stand up and run, but my body wouldn't move. The footsteps got closer. and closer. Then, just as the sound reached the edge of the lobby, it stopped. I waited, my breath held. I waited for something to happen. But nothing did. The silence returned. The neon sign outside buzzed softly. The air smelled like dust. The guest list sat on the screen, glowing faintly. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that the missing names were not just missing from the system. They were missing from the world. And the keys in the drawer were still waiting for someone to come and use them. I didn't sleep again that night. I think I was afraid that if I closed my eyes, I would wake up somewhere else. Or maybe I was afraid that if I slept, I would miss something important. Something that would explain the missing names, the blank keys, the hidden corridor. Something that would make all of it make sense. So I stayed awake. I stayed at the desk. I stared at the guest list until my eyes felt heavy, and I kept listening for sounds. The lobby was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears feel like they're ringing. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the neon sign outside flickered, casting a weak glow through the windows. I tried to focus on something normal, the smell of the carpet, the dust in the air, the faint hum of the air conditioner, but the quiet kept pushing in like a weight on my chest. I kept thinking about the hidden corridor, the photos, the records, my name on the guest list. And then I heard it. A sound from beneath the floor. At first I thought it was the building settling. Old motels creak, old buildings move, that's normal. But this sound wasn't a creak. It was footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps, like someone walking back and forth, like someone packing. I froze. The sound was faint but clear. It came from directly beneath the lobby, like someone was trapped under the floorboards, walking in circles. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I listened. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, as if someone was counting their steps. I walked to the center of the lobby and stood still, trying to pinpoint the sound. It seemed to come from under the carpet, from the foundation itself. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the floor. The footsteps were closer now, louder. The sound of shoes against wood. The rhythm of someone walking back and forth, like they couldn't stop. I pulled my ear away and sat back on my heels. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I told myself it was just the building, just the pipes, just the wind. But the sound was too regular, too human. It wasn't the building settling, it was someone walking. I stood up and walked toward the storage room. I thought maybe the sound was coming from there. Maybe someone was in the room below it. Maybe someone had been living there. I opened the storage room door slowly. The smell of dust and old supplies hit me. The room was empty. The shelves were full. Nothing moved. I stepped inside and looked at the back wall. The hidden door was still there, sealed shut. The seam in the wall was barely visible. The keyhole was still there, but the key was gone. I felt my heart drop. The key was gone. I hadn't taken it out of the motel. I hadn't thrown it away. I hadn't given it to anyone. I hadn't even touched it since the night the man checked in. But now it was gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wall, my mind racing. I felt a strange sense of dread, like something had moved while I wasn't looking, like someone had been watching me. I turned around and left the storage room. The footsteps beneath the lobby continued. I walked back to the front desk and sat down, my hands shaking. I tried to focus on the guest list again, but my mind kept drifting to the sound under the floor. The footsteps were getting louder. They sounded like someone packing closer to the desk, like someone walking directly beneath me. I stood up again and walked to the center of the lobby. I looked down at the carpet, trying to see if there was any sign of movement, but the carpet was still. The dust was still. The air was still. The footsteps continued, slow and steady. I took a deep breath and forced myself to speak out loud, even though no one was there. "Hello," I said softly. The footsteps stopped. My heart hammered in my chest. I waited, holding my breath. I waited for something to happen. After a few seconds, the footsteps started again. But this time, they were slower, like someone had heard me and decided to move more carefully. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should call someone. I didn't know if I should run. I didn't know if I was imagining it. I sat back down at the desk and tried to calm myself. I told myself that it was just my imagination, that the motel was old and the floors creaked, that the sound was just the building settling. But the footsteps kept going. They kept packing beneath the lobby, back and forth, back and forth. I stared at the carpet and I felt a strange urge to lift it, to see what was beneath, to find out who was walking under the floor. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was a bad idea, but the curiosity was stronger than my fear. I stood up and walked to the corner of the lobby where the carpet met the wall. I knelt down and pulled at the edge of the carpet. The carpet was stuck. It was nailed down, the edges were sealed, the floor was solid. I pulled harder, my fingers gripping the fabric. The carpet lifted slightly, just enough to reveal a small gap, a crack in the floorboards. I reached my hand into the gap and felt something cold. I pulled it out. It was a small old key. A key with no tag. A key that looked like it had been hidden for years. My hand shook as I held it. I looked at it closely. The metal was rusted and the shape was unusual. It wasn't like the keys on the desk. It wasn't like the keys in the drawer. This key looked older, like it belonged to a different time. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what it meant. Then I heard the footsteps again. They were closer now, directly beneath me, like someone was standing right under the desk, packing back and forth. I felt a sudden wave of panic. I dropped the key and stepped back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stared at the floor, listening. The footsteps continued, slow and steady. I felt like the sound was not just coming from beneath the floor, but from inside the building itself. Like the motel was alive, and something inside it was moving. I tried to force myself to stay calm. I tried to tell myself that it was just a person walking in the corridor, that someone had come in and was packing outside. But the sound was too deep, too close. It felt like it was under the foundation. I sat back down at the desk, my hands shaking. I stared at the guest list on the screen, trying to focus on something normal. The guest list felt meaningless now. The names felt like lies. The missing names felt like evidence of something terrible. I kept listening to the footsteps. They kept packing, back and forth under the floor. And then, for the first time, I heard something else. A voice. Not a whisper, not a clear voice, just a sound. A low, muffled voice like someone speaking through a wall. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the meaning. It was like someone was begging. Like someone was trapped. Like someone was saying, "Help me." The footsteps continued and the voice continued, and I felt my fear grow into something deeper, something that didn't have a name. I didn't know how long I sat there, listening to the sound beneath the floor. I didn't know how long I waited for it to stop. I didn't know how long I tried to convince myself that I was safe. But eventually, the footsteps slowed. They stopped. The voice faded. The silence returned. The neon sign outside flickered softly. The air smelled like dust. The lobby was quiet again. But the feeling remained. Like something was still there, under the floor. Like something was still packing. And I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that the motel was not just hiding people in its records. It was hiding them in its foundation. And whatever was trapped beneath, the lobby was still alive. Still waiting. I don't remember the exact moment when I stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like part of the motel. It wasn't a sudden change. It was more like a slow shift, like the air around me had quietly changed its temperature, and I hadn't noticed until I was already cold. The days and nights blurred together. The neon sign outside flickered and the fluorescent lights inside buzzed. The guest list kept filling with names, and then the names kept disappearing. The keys kept appearing in the drawer, even when I didn't remember placing them there. The motel felt like a living thing. I tried to keep my mind busy. I tried to focus on normal tasks. I cleaned the lobby. I checked the rooms. I answered the phone when it rang, even though it almost never rang. I wrote down notes. I tried to keep a routine. But the routine didn't feel like mine. It felt like something the motel wanted me to follow. And the more I followed it, the more I felt myself slipping. I began to notice things I hadn't noticed before. Small details that didn't make sense, like how the hallway lights never fully turned off. They always stayed dim, like the motel was afraid of the dark, like it wanted to keep everything visible, even when no one was around. Or how the guest list always had new entries, even when I hadn't checked anyone in. Or how the keys in the drawer seemed to shift positions, like someone had been touching them. One night, I found myself staring at the guest list again, trying to understand it. I had started to keep a separate notebook, writing down the names that were missing, the names that were erased, the names that had no checkout date. I wrote down the blank tags too. I wrote down the room numbers that didn't exist. I wrote down the names of people I had never met. I wrote down my own name because it had appeared on the guest records again. Not just once. Not just on the first night. It kept appearing like it was being written over and over. I stared at my name on the page, my hands trembling. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid. I was afraid that I had already been checked in. I was afraid that I was already part of the motel's records. I tried to tell myself it was just a mistake, that the motel's system was old and glitchy, that the hidden corridor and the missing names were just weird, but not real. But the fear wouldn't leave. The motel had a way of making you feel like you were being watched, like you were being recorded, like your life was being documented in a place you couldn't see. I tried to leave. I packed my bag. I put on my jacket. I walked to the front door. The door was locked. I pulled at it. I pushed at it. I tried the handle. Nothing. The lock didn't move. I felt my heart pounding. I tried to stay calm, but the panic rose in my chest like a wave. I looked around the lobby, searching for a way out. The windows were dark. The parking lot was empty. The trees outside swayed, but there was no sound of wind. The motel felt like it was holding its breath. I walked to the front desk and checked the computer. The system was running. The guest list was open. My name was there again, with a room number beside it. Room 11. I stared at it, my mind racing. Room 11 didn't exist, but the system said it did. I looked at the keys in the drawer. The key for room 11 was there, with a blank tag. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The metal was cold. I didn't want to go to room 11. I didn't want to open a door that didn't exist. I didn't want to be part of the motel's hidden history. But the key felt heavy in my hand, like it was pulling me. I walked to the hallway, my footsteps echoing softly. The carpet felt different now. It felt thicker, like it was absorbing sound. The air felt colder. I reached the end of the hallway, where the door to room 11 should have been. And there it was. The door. Old peeling paint. A small sign that said room 11. It looked like it had always been there, like it was part of the motel's design. My heart pounded. I stood in front of the door, staring at it. I could feel the motel behind me, like a presence pushing me forward, like it wanted me to open the door. I held the key up to the lock. My hand was shaking. I took a deep breath and turned the key. The lock clicked. The door opened. The air inside the room was cold and still. It smelled like old paper and dust. The light was dim, like the bulb had been burning for years. The room was empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like someone had been there recently, like the room was waiting for someone to return. I stepped inside slowly. The carpet was worn. The bed was made, but the sheets looked old. The curtains were drawn. The window was covered with a thick layer of dust. I walked to the bed and sat down, my hands still shaking. I looked around the room, trying to understand. There was a small table beside the bed. On the table was a notebook. I picked it up. The cover was worn and the pages were yellowed. The handwriting inside was neat and careful. It looked like someone had written it slowly, over a long period of time. I opened the notebook and began to read. The first page was a list of names. The names were familiar. They were the names of the missing guests, the names that had been erased from the system, the names that had no checkout dates. I flipped through the pages and I saw more names, more dates, more room numbers. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The last page. My name, written at the bottom with a date. Today's date. And a note. Welcome, you are now on the roster. I felt the room spin. I dropped the notebook and stood up, my heart pounding. I looked around the room, trying to find a way out. The door behind me was closed. I walked to it and tried the handle. It didn't move. The lock was still engaged. The door was locked from the inside. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I pressed my hands against the door, trying to push it open. But it didn't budge. I turned around, my eyes scanning the room. I looked at the bed. I looked at the table. I looked at the window. And then I noticed something else. A small, framed photograph on the table. It was a picture of the motel lobby. The same lobby I had been sitting in for days. The same lobby I had been trying to understand. But in the photo, the front desk was empty. And behind the desk, in the background, was a figure. A figure sitting in the chair, staring at the camera. A figure that looked like me, but older, tired, like someone who had been working the night shift for years. I felt my breath catch. I stared at the photograph, and I realized the truth. The motel didn't host guests. It held them. It collected them. It kept them in its hidden corridors, in its foundation, in its records. And now it had added me to the list. I felt the fear rise in my chest, but it wasn't the kind of fear that makes you want to scream. It was a quiet fear, a slow fear, a fear that settled into your bones and never leaves. I sat down on the bed again, my hands shaking. I stared at the notebook, at the names, at the date. I thought about the man who had checked in the first night, the man who asked for the room that wasn't there, the man who said the motel was not a place for guests, but a place for people who didn't want to be found. I thought about the missing names, the blank keys, the hidden corridor. I thought about the footsteps under the floor. And I understood. The night shift never ends. Because the motel never lets you leave. It keeps you. It records you. It holds you. And it waits for the next person to come in, tired and alone, thinking they just need a place to sleep, thinking they are safe, thinking they are just working a job. And then the motel slowly, quietly, makes them part of its story. I arrived in Maple Ridge on a cold, quiet morning, the kind of morning that makes you feel like the world is still waking up. The road into town was narrow, lined with tall trees that had lost most of their leaves. The air smelled like wet earth and old wood. I had been driving for hours and I was tired, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. I had come here because of a story. Not a story that anyone wanted to tell, but a story that everyone seemed to know. A story that was always spoken in quiet voices, like people were afraid of waking something up. The town of Maple Ridge had a school that closed overnight. That was the simple version. The version people said when they didn't want to talk about it. The version they told visitors to make them leave quickly. The version that made the story sound like a rumor. But I knew the real version. The real version was that the school closed because the children vanished. Not one or two, not a few, all of them. One day the school was full of kids. The next day it was empty. No one saw them leave. No one heard anything. No one knew where they went. The town locked the doors. The town shut the windows. The town pretended it never happened. And then the school was just gone. Not physically, it was still there. The building still stood. The classroom still existed. The desks still sat in rows, but the school was gone, like the heart of it had been removed. I pulled into the parking lot and stared at the building. It was a 2-story structure made of old brick. The windows were dark and dusty. The doors were locked. The playground was empty. The swings hung still, swaying slightly in the wind. It looked like a place that had been frozen in time. I stepped out of my car and felt the cold air hit my face. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. I wasn't here to scare myself. I was here to report, to find the truth, to write a story that would finally make sense of what happened. I walked toward the front entrance. The doors were locked, but the lock looked old. The kind of lock that could be opened with a simple tool if you knew how. I looked around, making sure no one was watching. The town was quiet, too quiet. There were no people on the street, no cars, no birds. Even the trees seemed still. I pulled out my tools and worked on the lock. It didn't take long. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward with a slow creak. I stepped inside. The air inside the school was cold and stale. It smelled like dust and old paint. The hallway was long and lined with lockers. The lockers were dented and scratched, their paint faded. Some of them were open, their contents spilled out. Old textbooks, torn notebooks, a few broken pencils. It felt like the students had left in a hurry. I walked down the hallway slowly, my footsteps echoing. The sound felt loud in the quiet building. I kept expecting to hear something else. A laugh, a shout, a teacher calling out a name. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I reached the main staircase and looked up. The stairs were old and worn, the steps smoothed by years of feet. I could almost imagine children running up and down them, their voices echoing through the halls. But the building was silent. I walked into the first classroom I saw. The door was slightly open, and the room looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of a lesson. The desks were still in rows. The chalkboard still had writing on it. The writing was faded, but I could still read it. Lesson 12, the importance of listening. The words felt strange, like they were meant for someone who was still there. I walked closer to the chalkboard and looked at the writing. It was neat, like a teacher had written it carefully. But there was something else on the board too. A message written in smaller letters, almost hidden. Listen. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know why those words made me feel uneasy, but they did. I stood there for a moment, staring at the board, trying to understand. Then I noticed something on the teacher's desk, a small stack of papers. I walked over and picked them up. They were old attendance records, names and dates, the kind of records that would normally be stored away, not left out on a desk. I flipped through the pages. The names were there, the children's names, the dates, the signatures. And then at the bottom of the last page, there was a note written in a different hand, a note that looked like it had been written quickly, in a hurry. It read, "Do not open the basement." My heart skipped. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Why would someone leave a note like that? Why would it be left in a classroom? Why would it be left in plain sight? I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. The windows were dark. The air was still. I set the papers down carefully and left the classroom. I walked back into the hallway and continued down the corridor. As I walked, I noticed that the lockers on one side of the hallway were all open. The ones on the other side were closed. The open lockers had their contents spilled out as if someone had emptied them quickly. The closed lockers looked untouched. I felt a strange sense of unease, like the building was showing me something, like it wanted me to notice the difference. I reached the end of the hallway and found a door labeled staff only. The door was locked, but the lock looked newer than the others, like it had been replaced recently. I tried the handle, it didn't move. I looked around and noticed a small window in the door. The glass was dirty, but I could still see inside. The room beyond looked like a staff lounge. There were chairs, a table, and a bulletin board. The bulletin board was covered with notices. I pressed my face close to the glass and tried to read the notices. Most of them were faded and hard to read, but one of them stood out. It was a notice about a meeting for parents. The date was the day before the school closed. The notice said, "Mandatory meeting for all parents. Please attend. The school will be closed tomorrow." I felt a cold chill run through me. The date was decades ago, but the words felt like they were written yesterday. I stepped back from the door and continued down the hallway. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. The silence was heavy, like the building itself was listening. I found the main office and pushed the door open. The office was dark, but I could see a desk in the corner. Papers were scattered across it. The phone was still there, the receiver off the hook. I walked to the desk and picked up the phone. The receiver was cold. I held it to my ear. Nothing. No dial tone, no static, just silence. I set the receiver down slowly and looked at the desk. There was a file folder with the school's name on it. I opened it and found documents inside. One of the documents was a list of missing children. The list was long. Too long. Names, ages, dates. And at the bottom of the page, a note. "Do not investigate." My heart pounded. I stared at the note, my mind trying to understand. Who wrote it? Why? Why would someone tell people not to investigate? I felt a wave of anger, but it was mixed with fear. The school felt like a trap, like a place that didn't want to be disturbed. I left the office and walked toward the back of the building. I found the door that led to the basement. It was old and heavy, with a small sign that said basement in faded letters. The door was locked. I tried the handle. It didn't move. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. I could feel the building's silence pressing against me. I could feel the weight of the missing children, like their absence was a physical thing. I turned away from the door and walked back toward the hallway. As I walked, I heard a sound. A faint sound, a soft, almost gentle sound. It was like a whisper. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I waited. Then the whisper started again. This time it was closer, like someone was speaking from just around the corner. I walked slowly toward the sound, my heart pounding. The hallway felt longer now, like it was stretching. The lockers seemed taller. The air felt colder. I reached the corner and looked down the hallway. There was no one there. Just the empty hallway, the dark windows, the still air. The whisper came again, and I realized it wasn't a whisper from a person. It was a sound from the building. The building was making the sound, like it was trying to speak. I stood there for a long time, listening to the whisper. I couldn't understand the words. I couldn't make sense of it, but I felt the meaning. It was like the building was trying to tell me something. Like it was warning me. Like it was begging me to leave. I turned and walked back toward the front entrance. The door was still unlocked, the lock still open, the outside world still waiting. I stepped outside and looked back at the school. The building stood there, silent and dark, like it was hiding something. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel. I tried to calm myself. I tried to tell myself it was just an old building, just an abandoned school, just a story. But I knew it was more than that. The school had closed overnight. The children had vanished, and the building was still trying to speak. I started the car and drove away, but the whisper followed me, like a sound trapped in the walls of my mind. And I knew even then that I would come back, because the story wasn't finished. Not yet. The first time I saw the classroom door, I thought it was just another locked room. Old buildings like that always have doors that stick, rooms that were sealed up and forgotten. I told myself that. I told myself it was nothing. But the door wasn't just locked. It was locked from the inside. And the school had been empty for decades. I walked down the hallway again slowly, as if moving too fast might wake something. The light from my flashlight cut through the dust in the air, making it look like tiny snowflakes drifting in a sunbeam. The sound of my shoes on the floorboards was loud, even though the building felt like it swallowed noise. It was a strange silence, one that didn't feel empty. It felt full, like something was hiding inside it. The classroom was near the end of the hall on the left side. The door was a pale, faded blue, and the paint was chipped. There was a small window in the door, the kind you see in schools so teachers can look in without opening it. The glass was dirty, and my flashlight made the smudges shine. I stopped in front of the door and looked at the handle. The handle was in the locked position. It wasn't the kind of lock that just sticks. It was the kind of lock that is meant to stay locked. I pressed my ear against the door, just for a moment, and listened. Nothing. No breathing, no movement, no sound of children, no sound of a teacher. Just silence. I pulled the handle, it didn't move. I tried again, harder, still nothing. I checked the window. I pressed my face close to the glass and tried to see inside. The dirt made it difficult, but I could make out the shape of desks. The chalkboard, the teacher's desk. Everything looked normal, like the room had been left in a hurry and then forgotten. But there was something else. A faint shape near the back of the room that looked like a shadow standing still. I pulled back from the window and stepped away from the door. My heart was beating faster, and I told myself to calm down. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself the shadow was probably a coat rack or a broken chair. Old buildings make your mind play tricks on you. I took a breath and looked at the door again. Then I saw it. The latch. It was a simple latch, the kind you can lock from the inside by turning a small knob, and it was turned. It was turned like someone had locked it. From the inside, I felt a cold sensation in my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like a realization, like something in my brain clicked into place and made a quiet, terrible sense. The room was locked from the inside. The building had been empty for years. So who locked it? Who was inside? I stood there for a long time, staring at the door. I wanted to walk away. I wanted to tell myself this was a dead building, a place with no life left in it. I wanted to believe that the locked door was just another part of the story that had been exaggerated by time. But I couldn't. The locked door didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like a message. I turned and walked back down the hall, looking for anything that might explain it. A teacher's key, a sign, a note, something. The hallway was quiet. The lockers were still. The air felt heavy, like the building was holding its breath. I passed a few classrooms that were open, their doors hanging slightly ajar. Inside, the desks were still in place. The chalkboard still had faded writing. The walls still had old posters. The school felt like it had been paused in the middle of a day, like time had been stopped and everything had been left exactly where it was. But the locked room was different. It felt like it was holding something in, or keeping something out. I went back to the main office and searched the drawers for a key. I found old forms, attendance records, and a few keys that looked like they belonged to cabinets. Nothing that looked like a classroom key. Nothing that looked like it would open a door that was locked from the inside. I sat at the desk for a moment, my head in my hands. I felt tired. Not just physically tired, but mentally tired. Like my mind was being pulled in a direction it didn't want to go. I tried to think logically. Maybe the door had been locked before the school was abandoned. Maybe someone locked it and then left, and the key was lost. Maybe the latch had been stuck in the locked position for years. But the latch was turned, not stuck, turned. And that didn't feel like something that happened by accident. I stood up and went back to the hallway. I looked at the locked door again, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small scratch on the wood, near the handle. A thin, dark line that looked like it had been made by a nail or a knife. It wasn't deep, it was subtle, but it was there. And it looked fresh. Not fresh like it had been made yesterday. Fresh like it had been made recently in the last few weeks or months. The wood around it wasn't dusty. The scratch stood out like a scar. My mind started to race. I thought about the stories I had heard in town, the whispers, the rumors, the way people looked away when the school was mentioned. The children vanished. The school closed overnight. The town never talked about it. And now a classroom door was locked from the inside. I stood there for a long time, staring at the scratch. My hand hovered near the handle, but I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I didn't want to be the one to open it. I took a step back and turned away, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop wondering what was inside. I walked down the hallway again, trying to shake the feeling, trying to focus on something else. I looked at the old posters on the walls. I read the faded words. Be kind. Be safe. Listen carefully. I stopped in front of a poster that had a drawing of a child holding a book. The child's eyes were drawn too big. The smile looked forced, like the child was pretending to be happy. I stared at the poster for a moment, and I felt something in my chest tighten. It was like the building was watching me, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I walked back to the locked door again. I couldn't help it. I was drawn to it, like something inside me wanted to know what was behind it. Like a part of me was already inside the room, even though I hadn't opened the door. I put my hand on the handle. It was cold. I tried the handle again, gently this time. It didn't move. I leaned in closer to the window and looked inside again. The dust on the glass made everything blurry, but I could see the desks, the chalkboard, the teacher's desk, and the shadow. The shadow was still there, standing in the back of the room. It hadn't moved. It hadn't changed. It was just there. I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry. My heart was beating so loudly I could feel it in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, just a shadow from a broken chair, just my mind playing games. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was real. I pulled my flashlight out and shone it through the window. The light hit the desks, it hit the chalkboard, it hit the floor. And then it hit the shadow. The shadow didn't react. It didn't move. It didn't shift. It didn't even seem to be affected by the light. It was like it was part of the room. Like it belonged there. Like it was waiting. I took a step back, my breath shallow. I looked at the door, the handle, the scratch, the locked latch. Then I realized something that made my skin crawl. The scratch wasn't just a scratch. It was a mark. A mark made by someone trying to get out. Or someone trying to get in. The thought hit me like a cold wave. If someone was inside, why were they locked in? If someone was outside, why were they trying to get in? I stood there for a moment, unable to move. The hallway felt longer. The air felt colder. The silence felt heavier. I felt like the building was holding its breath. And I realized with a sudden clarity that made my stomach drop, that the school wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting, waiting for someone to open the door, waiting for someone to let it speak, waiting for someone to listen. I turned away and walked back down the hall. My steps were quick now, but my heart was still pounding. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the shadow again. But I could feel it, like a presence behind the door, watching me leave. Like the room was still locked from the inside. Like the school was still full of children. Like the building had never really been empty at all. I didn't expect the chalkboard to change. I thought the school was simply old and abandoned. I thought it was frozen in time, a building that had been left behind like a broken toy. I expected dust, decay, and silence. But the chalkboard was different. It was clean. Not clean like someone had wiped it recently, but clean like it had been used yesterday, like it had been erased and rewritten over and over for years. I first noticed it on my second night at the school. I had come back because I couldn't stop thinking about the locked classroom. I couldn't stop thinking about the scratch on the door, the locked latch, and the shadow in the back of the room. I felt like I had left something unfinished. So I returned. The town was even quieter at night. The streetlights cast long, weak pools of light. The trees stood still like they were holding their breath. The school looked different at night, more alive somehow, more aware. I walked inside and moved through the hallway with my flashlight. The beam of light shook slightly in my hand, not because I was nervous, but because my body was tired and tense. I felt like I was walking through a memory. I reached the classroom I had visited before. The door was still locked, the latch still turned, the scratch still fresh. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to decide if I should try to open it again. I didn't, not yet. Instead, I walked further down the hall, to the classroom that had the chalkboard I had seen earlier. The room where the message, "Listen," had been written. The door was open. That was the first strange thing. I didn't remember leaving it open. I didn't remember opening it. But the door was open now, as if someone had been inside. I stepped into the room slowly. The air inside felt slightly warmer than the hallway, like the room had been occupied recently. The desks were in rows. The chalkboard was on the front wall. The teacher's desk sat in the corner, its surface covered with old papers. I walked to the chalkboard and looked at the writing. It was different. New writing. The words were fresh, like someone had written them only minutes ago. The writing said, "Good morning." I stared at the words, my mouth slightly open. I felt my heart beat faster. I felt a cold sensation in my stomach, like the building had just reached into me and touched something. Good morning. It was a simple phrase, a normal phrase, something a teacher might write at the start of a day. But the school was closed. The children were gone. And yet the chalkboard had a message, as if someone was still teaching. I looked around the room, half expecting to see a person, half expecting to see a teacher standing at the front, chalk in hand. But there was no one. Just the room, the desks, the chalkboard. I walked closer to the board and ran my finger along the writing. The chalk dust came off easily, like the words had been written with fresh chalk. The smell of chalk was strong in the air, sharp and clean. I stepped back and looked at the board again. I waited. I waited for something to happen. I waited for the writing to change. At first, nothing did. The room stayed still. The air stayed quiet. The dust hung in the light. Then slowly, as if someone was writing from far away, new words began to appear. They were faint at first, like the chalk was being pressed lightly against the board. Then the writing became darker, clearer. The new message read, "Do you remember?" My throat tightened. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The words were not just a question. They felt like a challenge, like the building was asking me to remember something I didn't want to remember. I looked around the room again. I looked at the desks, the chairs, the walls, the posters. Everything looked normal, but the chalkboard didn't feel normal. It felt like a living thing. I stepped closer and tried to wipe the board clean, just to see if the words would disappear. I grabbed a piece of chalk and tried to erase the writing. The chalk dust rose and the words faded slightly, but they didn't disappear completely. They stayed, faint but visible, like a ghost of the writing. I wiped again, harder. The words still remained. I stared at the board, my hands trembling slightly. I felt like I was losing control of the situation, like the school was controlling me. I set the chalk down and stepped away from the board. I looked at the room again, trying to find something else that might explain it. The teacher's desk was covered in papers. I walked over and picked up one of them. It was a worksheet, a simple math sheet. The answers were filled in, but the handwriting was strange. It looked like a child's handwriting, but it was too neat, too careful, like someone was trying to imitate a child. I flipped the paper over. There was another message, written on the back. Don't forget. I felt a wave of nausea. I set the paper down and stepped back from the desk. I looked at the chalkboard again. The words were still there. Good morning. Do you remember? Don't forget. I felt like the room was speaking to me, not with sound but with writing, not with voice but with messages that appeared when no one was there. I left the classroom and walked back into the hallway. My mind was racing. I tried to think logically. Maybe someone else was in the building. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe the town had someone who liked to scare visitors. But the school was locked. The doors were sealed. The town was quiet. No one would come here at night. No one would want to. And the writing was too precise, too intentional. I walked down the hall again, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just chalk, just dust, just an old building playing tricks. I reached the classroom again, the one with the locked door. The door was still locked, the latch still turned, the scratch still fresh. I looked at the door and then at the hallway. And then I noticed something else. On the floor near the door, there were small pieces of chalk, broken pieces, like someone had been writing and the chalk had snapped. I crouched down and picked one up. The chalk was new, not old and dusty like the rest of the building. New, clean chalk. I held it in my hand and felt a strange sensation. It was like holding a piece of evidence, like holding a clue. Someone had been writing. Someone had been teaching. Someone had been in the school. And it wasn't me. I stood up and looked down the hallway. The silence felt heavier now, like the building was waiting for me to do something, waiting for me to react. I walked back to the classroom with the chalkboard and entered again. The room felt warmer. The air felt thicker. The chalk smell was stronger. I looked at the board. New writing had appeared again. This time it was a list. A list of names. They were written in neat columns, like a teacher taking attendance. I recognized some of the names of the children who had vanished. My stomach dropped, my hands went cold. The names were written as if the children were still there, as if they were still attending class. I read the list slowly, trying to keep my voice steady in my own mind. The names were familiar, and yet they felt like strangers, like names I had heard in stories but never really believed. And then I noticed something else. One name was different. It was written in a darker chalk, bolder and more deliberate than the others. It was my name. I stared at it, my heart pounding. My mind felt like it was splitting. I felt a strange, sick feeling in my chest, like I had been punched. My name was on the board. I didn't write it. I hadn't been here before, not like this. I had come to the school as a journalist, as a visitor, as someone looking for answers. But my name was there, in the same list as the children. as if I belonged, as if I had been part of the class, as if I had always been there. I backed away from the board, my breathing shallow. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I felt like the building was reaching into my mind, pulling at something I didn't understand. I left the classroom and ran down the hallway, my footsteps loud and frantic. I didn't stop until I reached the front entrance. I pushed the door open and stepped outside into the cold night air. The town was still quiet. The streetlights still cast their weak light. The trees still stood still. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I tried to tell myself I was just tired. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. I tried to tell myself the chalkboard was a trick. But I knew deep down that it wasn't a trick. Someone was still teaching. Someone was still writing. Someone was still inside the school. And they were leaving messages for me. Messages that felt like a warning. Or a call. I got into my car and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The chalkboard messages stayed in my mind, like a sound you can't forget. Good morning. Do you remember? Don't forget. And my name, written in chalk, as if I had always been part of the class. I drove for a while, trying to calm down. The road was empty. The trees passed by in a blur. The town disappeared behind me. But the chalkboard messages stayed with me, like a whisper in the back of my mind. And I knew without a doubt that I would have to go back. Because the school wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The bell didn't ring like a bell should ring. It didn't have the bright, clear sound of a new bell. It didn't have the crisp, clean tone you hear in movies or in churches. It was deeper, heavier. It sounded like something old and tired, like it had been used for years and years and had forgotten how to be loud. It rang once, and the sound traveled through the empty halls like a long, slow wave. I was standing in the hallway near the front entrance when it happened. I had returned to the school again, even though I told myself I wouldn't. I had returned because the chalkboard messages were still in my head, because my name was written on that list, because I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was calling me back. I had spent the evening walking through the school, checking classrooms, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. I had found more chalk messages, but I had not found anyone. No footprints, no signs of a person, no evidence that someone else had been there. Just the chalk, just the writing, just the feeling that the building was alive. The night was quiet. The air outside was cold, and the trees made soft, whispering sounds as the wind moved through them. The streetlights cast weak circles of light, and the rest of the town was dark. I stood in the hallway and looked at the front doors. The glass was dark, reflecting my flashlight like a mirror. The building felt like it was holding its breath. I checked my watch. 11:59. I felt a strange tension in my body. Not fear exactly, but a sense of waiting. Like something was about to happen, like the building had a schedule. I tried to laugh at myself. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but my body didn't feel relaxed. My muscles were tight. My hands were slightly trembling. Then the bell rang. It sounded from somewhere deep inside the school. Not from the front, not from the hallway I was in. It sounded like it came from the roof, or from the old bell tower that I had seen when I first arrived. The sound was low and heavy. It echoed through the hallways, bouncing off the walls, traveling down the corridors. It was a sound that made the building feel bigger than it was. The bell rang once. Then the sound faded, leaving a ringing in my ears that didn't go away right away. The hallway felt colder. The air felt thicker. The silence felt heavier. I stood there frozen, waiting for something else. Then the bell rang again. This time the sound was closer. It felt like it was right above me. It was louder, but not in a loud way. It was louder in a way that made the air vibrate. The sound traveled through my body, like a low vibration in my chest. I felt my heart beat faster. I felt a sense of dread, not because the bell was ringing, but because the bell was ringing on its own. No one was there to ring it. The school was empty. The bell rang again. This time, the sound was so close I felt like I could reach up and touch it, like the bell was right above me, just out of sight. The sound traveled through the halls, through the classrooms, through the empty spaces. It echoed in the rooms where children once laughed and played. It echoed in the rooms where teachers once taught. And it echoed in the rooms where the children vanished. I stood in the hallway listening, and I felt something shift in my mind. It was a subtle shift, like a piece of the world moving slightly out of place, like the building was changing shape just a little. The bell rang again, and I realized something. The bell wasn't just ringing. It was signaling. It was calling. It was announcing something. The sound traveled through the halls and reached the classrooms. I could almost imagine the sound entering each room, passing through the desks, sliding along the chalkboards, and settling into the walls. The bell rang again. I felt a strange urge to move, to follow the sound, to see where it was coming from. I wanted to know why the bell was ringing. I wanted to know what it was trying to say. But at the same time, I felt a strong urge to stay still, to not move, to not disturb the building. It was like the school was telling me to stay quiet, to listen. I looked down the hallway and saw that the doors to the classrooms were still open. The lights were still off. The rooms were still dark. The only light was from my flashlight. I started walking down the hall slowly, my footsteps soft. The bell had stopped ringing, but the sound was still in the air. It was like the building had left a vibration behind, like a memory of the sound. I walked past the classrooms, one by one. The air felt colder in each room. The dust in the air made the light from my flashlight look like small floating particles. I reached the end of the hall and turned a corner. The bell sound seemed to follow me, like it was moving through the building with me. The sound was still there, even though the bell had stopped. I found myself in a part of the school I hadn't explored before. A smaller hallway, narrower, with fewer classrooms. The walls were lined with old bulletin boards. The boards were covered with faded notices, old photographs, and torn pieces of paper. I stopped and looked at one of the boards. The photographs were of children, class photos, smiling faces, bright eyes, the kind of photos that look innocent until you look too closely. I looked closer. The faces were familiar. Not because I knew them personally, but because I had seen their names in the missing children list. The list I had found in the main office. The list that had made my stomach drop. The children were there in the photos, smiling. And then I noticed something else. The children in the photos were not all looking at the camera. Some of them were looking off to the side. Some of them were looking at something behind the photographer, something that wasn't in the frame. And in a few photos, one child's eyes looked different. Not just different from the others, but different from themselves, like the eyes were not their own. I felt a chill run through me. I turned away from the bulletin board and continued down the hallway. The bell sound was still there, like a low hum in the air. I reached a door at the end of the hall. The door was different from the others. It was heavier, with a small window near the top. The window was dark and I couldn't see through it. The door had a sign on it that said Bell Room. I felt my heart beat faster. I had never seen that door before. I didn't remember it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the sign. The Bell Room, the place where the bell was located. The bell had rung. And now I was standing in front of the room where it came from. I reached out and touched the door. It was cold, the paint was chipped, the wood was old. I tried the handle. It was locked. I pulled back, my breath shallow. I looked at the door again. I looked at the hallway. The silence was heavy. The air felt thick. I realized something that made my stomach drop. The bell was ringing from inside the room, and the room was locked from the outside. I stood there for a long time, my hand still on the door. I felt the building's silence pressing against me. I felt the weight of the missing children, like their absence was a physical thing. The bell rang again. Not loudly, not like a warning, more like a quiet reminder. The sound traveled through the hallway, through the walls, through the empty rooms. And I understood, in a way that felt like a punch to the chest, that the school was still running. It was still following its schedule. Even without children. Even without teachers. Even without anyone to hear it. The bell rang again. And I realized the most frightening thing of all. The bell wasn't ringing for me. It was ringing for someone else. Someone who was still inside the building. Someone who was still part of the school. Someone who had never left. I stepped away from the door and walked back down the hallway, my steps slow and careful. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the door again. But I could feel it. Like a presence behind the wood. Like the bell was calling to someone. Like the school was still alive. And like it was still waiting for the next class to begin. I found the basement the way you find most things in old buildings, by accident, and then by the feeling that you were always meant to find it. I had been walking through the school for hours that night, moving from classroom to classroom, trying to make sense of the chalkboard messages and the locked door. The building felt like a maze, like it was designed to confuse anyone who didn't belong there. The hallways shifted in the way old buildings do, where the memory of people walking through them leaves a kind of invisible path. I could feel it, like the building was guiding me. I had been avoiding the basement door, not because I was afraid of basements. I've been in enough old houses to know they are usually just dark, dusty spaces full of old junk, but because the school had a strange way of making me feel like the basement was something more, like the basement was where the story went to hide. I found the door at the end of a hallway that I hadn't noticed before. The hallway was narrow, with a low ceiling. The walls were lined with old bulletin boards, their paper peeling and faded. The air felt colder there, as if the building had drawn the warmth out of the space. The basement door was old and heavy. The paint was chipped, and the sign on it was faded, but I could still read it. Basement. The door was locked, but not in the way the other doors were locked. The other locks looked old, worn, and forgotten. This lock looked newer, as if someone had taken the time to make sure it stayed shut. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering near the handle. I felt the familiar tension in my chest, the same feeling I'd had when I saw the locked classroom door, the same feeling I'd had when I read my name on the chalkboard. I took a breath and turned the handle. The door opened easily. It surprised me. It surprised me in the way that made my skin crawl, because it meant the lock wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep people in. The air that rushed out of the basement was cold and damp. It smelled like old concrete, mold, and something sweet underneath it, like old crayons. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The basement was larger than I expected. It was not just a small storage room. It was a whole level under the school, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. The light from my flashlight cut through the darkness, making the space feel even emptier. There were shelves along the walls, filled with boxes and old equipment. There were broken chairs stacked in a corner. There were filing cabinets with their drawers open, their contents spilled onto the floor. But what caught my attention first was the drawings. They were everywhere. Drawings taped to the walls, drawings scattered on the floor, drawings stacked in boxes, drawings hanging from strings like a child's art project that had been left unfinished. They were all done in the same style, simple, childlike drawings with thick lines and bright colors. The paper was old and yellowed, but the colors were still vivid, as if they had been drawn recently. I walked closer and picked one up. It was a drawing of a door. Not just any door, a specific door. A heavy wooden door with a small window near the top. A door with a faded sign on it. A door with a lock. The door in the drawing looked like the basement door. But the strange part wasn't that the door was drawn. The strange part was that the door in every drawing was the same. Every drawing showed the same door. Every drawing showed the same hallway. Every drawing showed the same place. And in every drawing, the door was open. I felt my heart beat faster. I felt the coldness in my chest spread. I looked at another drawing, then another, then another. They were all the same. But they were different too. Some drawings showed the door open just a crack, like someone was peeking through. Some drawings showed the door wide open, with light spilling out. Some drawings showed the door closed but with a shadow behind it. Some drawings showed a small figure standing in front of the door. A child. A child with a simple round head, stick arms, and a small body. The child was always drawn in the same place, always looking at the door. Sometimes the child was holding a piece of chalk. Sometimes the child was holding a book. Sometimes the child was holding nothing at all. The child's face was always blank. No eyes, no mouth, just a round head. It was like the child didn't have a face because they didn't need one. Like they were a symbol, not a person. I looked at the drawings longer, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. The child in the drawings looked like me. Not in the sense of my physical appearance, but in the sense of my posture, my stance, the way the child stood, looking at the door, waiting. The child's body language felt like mine, like someone had drawn my memory of standing in that hallway. I dropped the drawing back onto the pile and took a step back, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. I tried to tell myself that my mind was making connections where none existed. But the drawings kept pulling me in. I walked deeper into the basement, following the line of drawings taped to the wall. They led me like a path, like someone had arranged them intentionally to guide me. The further I went, the more drawings there were. The walls were covered in them. The floor was covered in them. There were drawings even on the ceiling, taped up with old, yellow tape. I felt like I was walking through a child's world, a world that had been built to be safe and simple. But the more I looked, the less safe it felt. The drawings weren't just of the door. They were of the hallway beyond the door. They were of the classroom. They were of the chalkboard. They were of the bell. They were of the school, but from the inside. From a child's perspective. I picked up another drawing. This one showed the door open and beyond it, a dark hallway. At the end of the hallway, there was a small figure standing in the darkness. The figure looked like a child, but it was taller than the others. Its arms were too long. Its head was slightly tilted, as if it was listening. The figure's face was blank too. I felt my breath catch. I put the drawing down and looked around the basement, trying to find the source of the drawings. I looked at the shelves, the boxes, the filing cabinets. I looked for a desk, a table, something that might have been used to draw all of this. There was nothing. No crayons, no markers, no paper, no signs of art supplies. It was as if the drawings had appeared there, fully formed, without anyone ever creating them. I moved toward a box that was stacked near the wall. It was labeled with a faded sticker. Art projects. I opened the box carefully. Inside were more drawings neatly stacked. I pulled out a stack and flipped through them. They were all the same door, the same hallway, the same child, the same blank face. But there was one drawing that was different. It was a drawing of the basement door, but the door was closed. And on the door, there was a small note taped to it. The note was drawn in the picture, but it looked like real paper, like the child had drawn the paper itself. The note said, "Don't open." I felt my hands go cold. I felt a sudden rush of fear, the kind that makes your body feel heavy. I looked at the drawing again, and then I looked at the real door behind me. The door was still there, heavy and closed. The lock was still in place. The sign was still faded. The air was still cold. I felt a strange urge to run, to get out of the basement, to leave the school behind. But I also felt a strange urge to stay. Like the drawings were pulling me deeper, like they wanted me to see what was behind the door. I walked back toward the wall where the drawings were taped. I looked closer at the drawings, trying to find something I had missed. And then I saw it. A small detail that I hadn't noticed before. In the drawings where the door was open, the hallway beyond it was always dark. But in one drawing, the hallway had a faint glow, a soft, pale light like moonlight. And in that drawing, the child was not standing in front of the door. The child was inside the hallway. The child was walking away. I stared at that drawing for a long time. My mind kept going back to it. The idea of the child walking away. The idea of the door being open. The idea of the hallway being lit. I felt something shift in me, a quiet sense of understanding. The drawings weren't just random. They were telling a story of someone trying to leave, a story of someone trapped, a story of someone who had been here before. And now I was standing in the same place, looking at the same drawings, feeling the same fear. I turned and looked at the basement door again. The lock, the sign, the darkness beyond. The drawings were all around me like a circle, like a boundary, like a warning. I realized then that the basement wasn't just filled with drawings. It was filled with memories. And the memories weren't mine. They belonged to the children. Or to someone else. Someone who had been here, drawing the same door over and over, trying to make sense of it. I took a step back and felt the air change. It felt like the basement was listening, like the building was aware of me, aware of my presence. I felt a strange, quiet sadness wash over me. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, like the building was holding onto the past and the past was holding onto the building. I stood there for a long time, surrounded by the drawings, feeling the weight of the silence. Then quietly, I heard something. A soft sound, like a pencil scratching on paper. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. It was not loud. It was not sharp. It was gentle, like someone drawing slowly, carefully. I looked around the basement, but there was no one. No one moving, no one breathing, no one in sight. But the sound continued. Scratch, scratch, scratch. And I realized with a sudden chill that the sound was coming from the wall, from the drawings, from the paper itself. Like the drawings were being made right now. Like someone was still drawing. Like someone was still trapped. Like someone was still waiting. I turned and walked toward the basement door. I didn't look at the drawings again. I didn't want to see what they might show next. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The air was warmer. The light was dim. The silence was still heavy, but it felt different, like the building had noticed I had been in the basement. I walked away from the door, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I knew one thing clearly. The basement was not a storage space. It was a place of memories. And the memories were not finished. They were still being written, still being drawn, still waiting for someone to see them. I remember the moment I understood the truth. It wasn't a sudden shock like you see in movies. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of realization that settles into your bones, slow and steady, until you can't ignore it anymore. I had been in the school for days, though it felt like weeks. The building didn't obey time the way normal places do. I would check my phone, and the battery would still be the same. The clock on the wall would keep moving, but it didn't match the way the sun moved outside. It was as if the school lived in its own little loop, a pocket of time that didn't quite belong to the world. I kept telling myself I was there for the story. I was there to uncover what happened to the children. I was there to write the truth. But the truth kept slipping away from me, like something wet and slippery in your hands. And then, on the fourth night, I found the room. It was not marked on any map. It wasn't a classroom. It wasn't a storage room. It was a small space behind a wall that I only found because the paint was slightly different, like someone had tried to hide it. The door was plain with no sign, no label, no hint of what was inside. I stood in front of it for a long time, my hand on the handle, feeling the weight of the silence. I had already seen enough strange things to know that I should be careful. I had already seen the locked classroom, the chalkboard messages, the bell that rang by itself, the basement full of drawings. But this door felt different. It felt like a boundary. I opened it. Inside was a small room, no bigger than a closet. The walls were bare except for one thing. A blackboard. Not a chalkboard, but a blackboard. The kind you see in old classrooms. The kind that makes a soft, dusty sound when you run your finger over it. And written on it, in clean white chalk, was a sentence that made my stomach drop. Welcome back. I stood there staring at the words, feeling the cold crawl up my spine. I didn't know who had written it. I didn't know when it had been written. I didn't know how it could still be there, fresh and clear, in a building that had been abandoned for decades. The words felt like a hand on my shoulder. I looked around the room, my flashlight shaking slightly. There was nothing else in there. No desk, no chair, no supplies, just the blackboard. And then I noticed something else. The blackboard was not empty. There were faint marks on it, like someone had erased something. Like there had been writing there before, and it had been wiped away. I stepped closer and ran my finger across the surface. The chalk dust stuck to my skin. I could see the faint outlines of letters like ghosts. I took a deep breath and whispered, "What was here?" My voice sounded small in the room. I leaned closer and started to trace the faint letters with my finger. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to understand. Maybe it was something else, something deeper. The letters slowly formed a sentence. A sentence that was not written in English. It was written in the kind of writing you learn in school, the kind that looks simple and innocent, like a child's handwriting. And then I understood. It wasn't a message to me. It was a lesson. A lesson that had been written for someone else. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I looked at the blackboard again, and the faint letters seemed to rearrange themselves, like they were moving just slightly under the surface, like the chalk dust was shifting. The message became clearer. The lesson never ends. I felt my throat tighten. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. It was like a warning, like a rule, like a law. I turned around slowly, feeling the air in the room change. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like someone was watching me. I stepped out of the room and shut the door. The hallway outside was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the building is holding its breath. I walked back toward the main corridor, trying to shake the feeling that I had just crossed a line. As I walked, I realized that the school had been acting differently lately. The doors that had been locked were now open. The lights that had been off were now flickering. The air felt warmer, as if something had shifted. I passed the locked classroom again, the one that had been locked from the inside, the one that had my name on the chalkboard. The door was now slightly open. I stopped. My hand went to the handle, but I didn't touch it. I stood there staring at the gap, feeling the dread build. I knew what was behind that door now. I knew what the school was hiding. The school didn't close. It was sealed. The children didn't leave. They were never allowed to leave. The realization hit me like a wave. The school wasn't abandoned. It was occupied. Not by ghosts, not by spirits, not by anything supernatural in the way people imagine. It was occupied by something else, something that didn't need bodies to be present, something that needed attention, something that needed students, something that needed the lesson. I walked away from the door, my mind racing. I tried to think of the town, the people who had lived there, the parents, the teachers, the officials, the ones who had called it a tragedy, the ones who had said the children were gone. Gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. But the truth was worse. The children were still here. In a way. I kept walking, and I found myself back in the basement. I don't know why I went back. Maybe I was looking for answers. Maybe I was looking for proof. Maybe I was looking for something to hold on to. The basement was darker than before. The air felt heavier. The drawings were still there, but they seemed more crowded, more intense, like the basement had been waiting for me to come back. I walked through the drawings, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it. Not a drawing. A real door. A door I hadn't noticed before. It was hidden behind a stack of boxes, almost completely covered. The paint on it was fresh, as if it had been painted recently. The handle was shining. It didn't look like the other doors. It didn't look old. It looked new. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. I reached out and touched the handle. It was cold. The air around it felt colder. I felt a strange sense of dread, like the building was warning me not to open it. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. Inside was a narrow hallway. It was dimly lit with a faint glow at the end. The hallway looked like it belonged to a modern building, not an old school. The walls were clean. The floor was smooth. And at the end of the hallway was a classroom. A classroom that looked like it had been used yesterday. The desks were arranged neatly. The chairs were pushed in. The blackboard was clean. And on the blackboard, written in fresh chalk, were the words, "Welcome back, students." My breath caught. I felt the room tilt slightly, like the world had shifted. I stepped closer, my footsteps quiet on the floor. I looked at the desks. They were all empty, but I could feel them. Like the presence of children was still there. Like the air itself remembered the sound of laughter and whispers and the scratch of pencils. I looked at the blackboard again, and the words seemed to move slightly, like they were alive. "Welcome back, students." The phrase repeated itself in my mind, over and over, like a chant. And then I understood the full horror of it. The town didn't lose the children. The town locked them in. The school didn't close. It was sealed. The lesson never ended. And now somehow I was part of it. I felt a cold, creeping fear wrap around me. Not because I thought I would die, but because I realized something else. The school didn't need bodies to keep the lesson going. It just needed someone to come back. Someone to open the door. Someone to read the words. Someone to remember. And I had done all of that. I stood there in the classroom, feeling the silence press in, and I knew that the school had been waiting for me. Waiting for someone to return. Waiting for someone to join the lesson. Waiting for someone to never leave. The first time I saw the radio station, it looked like a building that had forgotten the world. Not abandoned, exactly. More like it was waiting for something that never came. The sign above the door said WBRK in faded letters, the kind that had once been bright but now looked tired, like they had been exposed to too many winters. It was on the edge of town, where the streetlights were weak and the road narrowed into a quiet stretch that led toward the woods. I had driven past it a few times before, but I never paid much attention. It was just another small-town building, the kind you don't notice until you need it. Then one night, I saw the station's lights on. It was late. The kind of late that makes you feel like you are the only person awake in the world. The clock in my car read 11:45 p.m., and the town felt like it was holding its breath. I parked in the empty lot and walked toward the door. The air was cold, and I could see my breath in front of me. The building's windows were dark, but the glow inside made the blinds look like they were slightly open, as if someone was watching. I had applied for the job a week earlier. The posting said, night shift radio operator, 12 a.m., 4 a.m. small town. No experience NEEDED. It sounded simple. It sounded easy. It sounded like something I could do while I worked on my writing. I had been out of work for a while and I needed the money. The town didn't offer many options, especially at night, so I took it. The door was unlocked, which surprised me. Most places at that hour keep their doors locked, even if someone is inside. But WBRK didn't feel like most places. I stepped inside and the air hit me. It smelled like old paper and dust, with a faint hint of something sweet, like an old perfume that had been trapped in the walls. The lobby was small. There was a worn couch, a coffee table with old magazines, and a bulletin board with notices that looked like they had been posted years ago. A small desk sat near the window, with a phone that looked like it belonged in another decade. Next to it was a sign that read, Night Shift Rules. I walked toward the desk and found a notebook. Inside, the rules were written in neat handwriting. Rule 1. Do not leave the building after midnight. Rule 2. Do not answer the phone unless it rings twice. Rule 3. Do not speak the station's name out loud. Rule 4. Do not turn off the transmitter. Rule 5. Do not go into the back room. I read the rules twice, then sat down, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease. The desk was cold, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. I looked around for the person who hired me, but there was no one. No voice, no footsteps, no sign of life. Then a small speaker crackled. A voice came through, soft and distant, like it was speaking from far away. Welcome to WBRK. The voice was calm, almost friendly, but something about it made my skin prickle. I'm here, I said, because I didn't know what else to do. The speaker crackled again. Good, you are on the night shift now. I waited. My heart was beating faster. I felt the silence in the room thick and heavy. Your first task, the voice said, is to keep the station alive. How do I do that? I asked. There was a pause, a long pause like the voice was thinking. Broadcast, it said finally. At midnight you will broadcast. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:55 p.m. I didn't know what I was supposed to broadcast. I didn't know what the station normally played. The station's website had no information. The phone number on the sign-in sheet didn't work. I felt a strange sense of being watched. I looked around the lobby again, but there was no one. Just the furniture, just the quiet. The clock ticked closer to midnight. At 11:59, the lights in the building dimmed, as if the station itself was taking a deep breath. The speaker crackled again. Begin, the voice said. I stood up and walked into the main room. The station was small, with a few old microphones, a mixing board, and a wall of equipment that looked like it had been there since the 1970s. There was a large window that looked into another room, but the glass was dark, like it was tinted. I sat down in front of the microphone, feeling the cold metal under my fingers. The headset felt heavy on my head. I put it on, and the world went quiet. I could hear my own breathing, loud in my ears. The clock struck midnight. The transmitter turned on with a low hum, like a machine waking up. The speaker crackled and the voice said, "You are live." My throat felt dry. I cleared it and then spoke into the microphone. "Hello," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "This is WBRK. It's midnight. This is your night shift operator." There was a pause. The silence felt heavy, like it was pressing against my chest. Then a sound came through the headset. Not music, not static. It was a faint sound, like someone whispering from far away. I leaned closer to the microphone. "Who is that?" I asked, my voice softer now. The whispering stopped. The speaker crackled again. "Do you hear us?" the voice asked. "I hear something," I said, "but I don't know what it is." The voice sounded pleased. "Good, keep listening." I sat there, staring at the mixing board, feeling the dread grow. I had expected the night to be quiet. I had expected to read or write or simply sit and wait for morning. But the station didn't feel quiet. It felt alive. At 12:10 a.m., the speaker crackled again. "Tell them a story," the voice said. "A story," I repeated, confused. "Yes," the voice said. "A true story, a story from the town." I swallowed. "I don't know any stories." "You do," the voice said. "You are here, you have heard the rumors, you have seen the building, you know what happened." I stared at the microphone, feeling the weight of the moment. I had come here for a job. I hadn't come here to become part of something I didn't understand. But the voice was right. I did know stories. Everyone in town knew stories. Everyone knew what happened to the missing people. Everyone knew about the old cases that never got solved. Everyone knew about the strange things that happened at night. I thought of the woman who disappeared from the diner, the man who vanished from the river, the boy who never came home from school. I thought of the rumors that the station was cursed, that it only broadcast at midnight because something inside it woke up at that hour. I thought of the way the town seemed to stop moving after dark, like it was hiding. I took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. "Okay," I said, "I'll tell a story." The voice on the speaker made a soft sound, almost like a sigh of approval. "Begin," it said. I closed my eyes and I began to speak. I told the story of the woman from the diner. I told it slowly, with details, with the kind of quiet that makes a story feel real. I described the way she used to laugh, the way her hands shook when she was nervous, the way she had been last seen walking toward the station. I described the way the town reacted when she disappeared, the way people pretended they didn't care, the way they whispered behind their hands. As I spoke, I felt something shift in the room. The air grew colder. The lights flickered slightly. I kept talking because I couldn't stop now. When I finished, the station was silent. The speaker crackled. "Good," the voice said. "Now listen." The whispering returned. It was louder now, like someone was closer. I felt my skin prickle. I looked around the room, but there was still no one. Then I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong to the station. A sound from the hallway outside. Footsteps. Slow footsteps moving toward the door. My heart began to race. I didn't move. I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want to call attention to myself. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I held my breath. Then the door handle turned. Slowly. Just a little. Not enough to open the door, just enough to show that someone was there. I could feel the presence of someone on the other side, and it wasn't human in the way I expected. It felt like the air itself was watching. The voice on the speaker spoke again, calm as ever. "Do not leave the building after midnight," it said. I stared at the door, my hands trembling. "I'm not leaving," I whispered. The handle stopped moving. The room fell silent again. But the feeling didn't leave. The station was not just a building. It was a place that held something. And I had just become part of its night shift. The clock kept ticking. The transmitter kept humming. And somewhere in the dark hallway outside, something waited. The night after my first shift at WBRK, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the door, the voice, and the way the station felt like it was breathing. I kept thinking about the rule: do not leave the building after midnight. But the clock on my phone said it was only 2 a.m. and I was still at home. I kept replaying the sound of the footsteps in the hallway. The way the handle turned slowly, like someone was testing it. The way the voice on the speaker had been so calm, as if it was always in control. I tried to convince myself it was just an old building, an old job, and my imagination. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I could feel the station in my bones. The next night I went back. The lobby was the same. The desk was the same. The rules were still written in the notebook. The air still smelled like old paper and dust. But the station felt different. It felt like it was waiting for me. I sat at the desk and waited for the clock to reach midnight. I watched the seconds move slowly, like the hands were moving through thick honey. When the clock finally struck 12, the transmitter hummed to life. The voice came through the speaker. "Good evening," it said. "Are you ready?" "Yes," I said. My voice sounded steadier this time, but I could still feel the fear under it. "I'm ready." "Then begin," the voice said. I sat down at the microphone and took a breath. I spoke softly, like I was trying not to wake something. "Good evening," I said. "This is WBRK, it's midnight. You are listening to the night shift." I paused, listening. The silence on the other side of the airwaves was thick. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Then, after a moment, the speaker crackled. A voice came through. It was quiet, barely there, like someone was speaking from a distance or through a wall. "Hello," the voice whispered. I leaned closer to the microphone. "Hello," I whispered back. "Who is this?" There was a pause. Then the voice spoke again. "I'm here," it said. "I'm here and I'm watching." My skin went cold. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was a long silence, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the air itself is listening. Then the voice whispered, "I can't say my name." I frowned. "Why not?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, it said something that made my blood run cold. "Don't say your name," the voice whispered. "They listen." I stared at the microphone, my heart pounding. The voice sounded like it was coming from a person, but it didn't sound like a normal person. It sounded like someone who was afraid, someone who was trapped. I asked, "Who is watching you?" The voice hesitated, then said, "The one in the window." I froze. The window. The dark glass in the station, the one that looked into the other room, the one that never seemed to show anything. I looked up at it, my throat tight. The window was dark, but I could feel something behind it, something waiting. The voice continued, whispering, "He watches from the window. He watches the town. He watches the station." I swallowed hard. "Who is he?" The voice whispered, "He doesn't have a name, he has a shape." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond to something that sounded like it was speaking from inside a nightmare. Then the voice said, I hear you breathing, I hear you thinking." I pulled the headset off for a moment, my hands shaking. I stared at the mixing board, feeling the dread grow. I put the headset back on. The voice was still there. "I'm not alone," the voice whispered. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The voice paused. Then it said, "In the town, in the dark, in the places you don't go." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I thought of all the places in the town that were avoided after dark. The abandoned park, the old mill, the river road, the cemetery. I thought of the stories, the missing people, the rumors. The voice whispered, "I call you because you listen." I hesitated. "Why me?" The voice spoke softly, almost like it was ashamed. "Because you are new, because you don't belong yet." I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" The voice whispered, "They need someone to keep the station alive. They need someone to speak." My blood ran cold. I remembered the rules. The rule that said, "Do not turn off the transmitter." The rule that said, "Do not leave the building after midnight." The rule that said, do not speak the station's name out loud. I realized then that the station wasn't just a place. It was a machine. A machine that fed on stories, on voices, on attention. I looked at the clock. It was 12:30. The night was still young, but I felt like I had already been awake for hours. I asked the voice, "What do you want?" The voice whispered, "I want you to tell the story of the town. I want you to tell it to the ones who are listening." "Who is listening?" I asked. The voice paused. Then it said, "They are all listening. The ones who disappeared, the ones who never came home, the ones who are still here." I felt my throat tighten. I couldn't breathe. The voice whispered, "They call in every night." I stared at the microphone. "Who calls?" The voice said, "The silent callers." I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" The voice whispered, "They call, but they never speak their names. They only describe what they see. They only describe the watching." I felt a cold wave wash over me. I had to know. I asked, "Can I talk to one of them?" The voice was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "Yes, but be careful, they don't like to be heard." My hands shook as I pressed the button to open the line. The phone on the desk rang once. Twice. I held my breath. The line clicked open. A whisper came through. "Hello," it said, soft and distant. I leaned closer to the microphone. "Hello," I whispered back. "Who is this?" The whisper paused, like the person was thinking. Then it spoke again. "I'm in the river," it whispered. My heart jumped. "The river," I repeated. "Which river?" The whisper didn't answer. Instead it said, "I'm in the water. I can hear the station. I can hear you." I swallowed hard. "Are you okay?" The whisper laughed softly, but it sounded like crying. "Okay? No, I'm not okay. I'm not okay, and I can't leave." My stomach turned. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "What happened to you?" The whisper paused, then said, "They took me." My breath caught. "Who took you?" I asked. The whisper didn't answer. Instead it said, "He watches from the window. He watches the town. He watches the station." I felt the room grow colder. The lights flickered. The whisper continued, "He is here. He is always here." I could barely hear the whisper now, as if it was fading away. I pressed the button to keep the line open, but the whisper grew quieter. Then the whisper said, "Don't say your name." The line went dead. The phone clicked off. The room fell silent. I sat there staring at the phone, my hands shaking. I could still feel the presence of the whisper in the air, like a faint shadow. The voice on the speaker spoke again, calm as ever. "Good," it said. "You have spoken to one of them." I didn't know what to say. The voice continued, "They will call again. They always call again." I stared at the clock. It was 12:55 a.m. The night was almost over, but I felt like I had just stepped into something I couldn't escape. The voice spoke softly, like a lullaby. "Remember the rules," it said. "Do not leave. Do not turn off the transmitter. Do not speak the station's name out loud." I nodded, though the voice couldn't see me. "I understand," I whispered. The voice paused, then said, "Good, now listen." I sat back in my chair, my heart still pounding, and I listened to the silence. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with whispers. The silent callers. They were out there. They were listening. And they were waiting for me to speak again. I found the tape on a night when the station felt unusually quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, even when nothing is happening. I had been at WBRK for a few weeks now, and the job had started to feel normal. Not safe, not comfortable, but normal in the way that a dark room becomes normal after you've been in it long enough. The rules were still there. The voice was still there. The silent callers were still there. But that night, I felt a pull toward the closet. It was a small room tucked away behind the studio. I had avoided it at first because of the rule. Do not go into the back room. The rule didn't say why. It didn't say what was in there. It just said not to go. But I had been thinking about the rule more and more lately. I had been thinking about the way the station seemed to be hiding something. The way the voice always sounded calm, like it had been through this before. The way the silent callers never gave their names, only descriptions. I needed to know. So that night, when the air in the studio felt heavy, I walked toward the closet. The door was old and worn, the paint chipped around the edges. The handle was cold when I touched it. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. The closet was dark. It smelled like old plastic and dust. There were boxes stacked on shelves, old equipment, and a few old tapes in a small plastic bin. I stepped inside and grabbed a flashlight. I didn't know why, but the act of holding the light made me feel a little more in control. I began to look through the tapes. Most of them were blank. Some were labeled with dates. Some had simple notes like test or promo. The handwriting on the labels looked old, like it had been written by someone who had used the station long before I was hired. Then I saw one tape that stood out. It was different. The label was worn, but the writing was clear. It was written in the same neat handwriting as the rules in the notebook. The label read, "Lost Broadcast." I stared at it for a moment, my heart beating faster. Lost broadcast. That meant someone had recorded something and never aired it. That meant someone had decided it was not meant for the listeners. That meant the station had hidden something. I held the tape in my hand, feeling the weight of it. The plastic felt cold, like it had been stored in a cold room for years. I took the tape out and walked back to the studio. The equipment in the studio was old, but it still worked. I had learned how to use it during my first nights. The tape player sat on a shelf, dusty and quiet. I inserted the tape. The machine clicked. The tape began to spin. The speaker crackled, and the voice on the other end said, "You found it." I froze. The voice sounded like the same voice that spoke to me every night. The calm voice. The voice that sounded like it belonged to the station itself. I pulled the headset off and stared at the tape player. I didn't move. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing. The voice continued, "It was waiting for you." My hands were shaking. I put the headset back on because I needed to know what was on the tape. The voice on the tape said, "This is WBRK, midnight, the night shift." I listened closely. The voice was different. It sounded older. It sounded like it had been recorded long ago. I could hear the faint sound of someone breathing. The breathing sounded tired. The breathing sounded scared. The voice on the tape continued, "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be recording, but I need someone to hear this." My stomach tightened. I felt a cold wave wash over me. The voice on the tape spoke again. "The station isn't just a station. It's a door. It's a mouth. It's a place that eats voices." I swallowed hard. The voice continued. "They told me to keep the station alive. They told me to keep the transmitter on. They told me not to leave. They told me not to speak the name." I felt my hands tremble. The voice whispered, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't keep quiet. I couldn't keep the story inside. The tape crackled, and the voice became quieter, as if the person was speaking from far away. "I heard the callers," the voice said. "I heard them every night. They whisper. They never speak their names. They only describe what they see." I felt my skin go cold. The voice on the tape continued. "They are not just listeners. They are prisoners. They are trapped in the town, in the air, in the sound." I leaned closer to the microphone, my breath shallow. I felt like I was listening to someone's last confession. The voice on the tape whispered, "The station is not broadcasting to the world. It's broadcasting to the town. It's broadcasting to the ones who are already here." My heart pounded. The voice continued, "They are waiting for someone new. someone who will speak, someone who will keep the station alive. I stared at the tape player, my mind racing. The voice on the tape said, I tried to leave. I tried to turn off the transmitter, but it wouldn't turn off. The machine wouldn't let me. I felt my throat tighten. The voice whispered, and then I heard the footsteps. My breath caught. The voice on the tape paused. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the background, slow and steady. The voice whispered, they came for me. I sat very still, my eyes fixed on the tape player. The voice on the tape continued, I don't know how long I've been here. I don't know how long the station has been alive. I don't know if I'm still alive. The tape crackled, and the voice became clearer again. I'm leaving this message for whoever finds it, the voice said. If you are listening, you are next. If you are listening, you have already been chosen. My hands went cold. The voice whispered, do not say your name, do not turn off the transmitter, do not leave, do not go into the back room. I stared at the tape player, feeling the weight of the words. The voice on the tape continued, if you hear the footsteps, don't answer the door. If you hear the whispering, don't speak back. I swallowed hard. Who is it? I whispered, though I knew the tape wouldn't answer. The voice on the tape didn't answer. It just continued, in a tone that sounded like it was pleading. They are in the walls, the voice whispered. They are in the air, they are in the sound. The tape crackled again, and the voice grew faint. Remember, the voice whispered, the station is listening. The station is always listening. The tape ended. The room was silent. I sat there for a long time, staring at the tape player. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. The silence felt heavy, like a blanket covering the room. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should destroy the tape. I didn't know if I should keep it. I didn't know if I should tell someone. But I knew one thing. The station had been hiding something for a long time. The lost broadcast was not lost by accident. It was lost on purpose. And now the station had found me. The static always comes first. It's the same sound every night, like a thin blanket of noise that covers everything. It starts soft, almost gentle, and then it grows, filling the room until it feels like the air itself is vibrating. When I first started at WBRK, I thought the static was just part of the old equipment. I thought it was normal. I thought it was the kind of thing you learn to ignore. But the static isn't normal. It's not just noise. It's a door. It's a place where things can slip through. That night I was on the shift alone. The station felt quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. The lights were dim. The air was still. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, like it was trying not to make any sound. I had been listening to the silent callers all night. I had been waiting for the next one. I had been trying to stay calm, trying to keep my voice steady. I had been telling myself that the station was just a job, just a building, just a place. But I knew, deep down, that it was more than that. At 2:30 a.m., the transmitter hummed a little louder than usual. The static in the speakers grew thicker, and I felt the hair on my arms rise. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the desk. The voice on the speaker came through, calm as ever. "Good evening," it said. "Are you listening?" "Yes," I whispered. "Good," the voice said. "Listen carefully." The static grew louder. Then through the static, I heard something else. A voice. At first I thought it was another caller, another person trying to reach out, another whisper from the town. But the voice wasn't a stranger. It was mine. Not in the way that your voice sounds when you hear a recording. Not in the way you recognize your own voice from a phone call. This was my voice, speaking in real time as if I were speaking into the microphone. But I was. I sat very still, my heart pounding. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly. I didn't want to interrupt whatever was happening. The voice in the static spoke slowly, clearly. Hello, it said. I stared at the microphone, my mouth dry. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I was hearing things. The voice continued, "You shouldn't be here." My skin went cold. I hadn't said that. Not out loud, not ever. The voice spoke again, "You shouldn't have come back." My hands shook. I could feel the sweat on my palms. The voice in the static was still speaking, but it was not coming from the microphone. It was coming from the air, like it was inside the room with me. I whispered, "Who is that?" The voice answered, "It's you." I swallowed hard. "No, it's not." The voice laughed softly. It sounded like my laugh, but it was wrong. It was thin, like a sound that had been stretched too far. "You're wrong," the voice said. "It is you." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. The voice continued, "You're the one who keeps the station alive." I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. I couldn't get the words out. The voice in the static spoke again. "You're the one who tells the stories." I shook my head, even though no one could see me. "I don't want to." The voice said, "You do." I felt my heart racing. I felt like I was losing control of my own body, like the station was taking over. The voice continued, "You're already part of it." I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block the sound. It didn't work. The voice was inside my head now, like it had found a way in. The voice in the static spoke softly, almost gently. "Do you remember the first night?" I swallowed hard. "Yes." "Do you remember the rules?" the voice asked. I nodded, though no one could see me. "Yes." The voice continued, "Do you remember the silent callers?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yes." The voice in the static spoke again. "They are not calling you. They are calling him." I froze. "Him," I whispered. The voice answered, "The one in the window." My blood ran cold. I looked at the dark glass of the window, feeling the presence of something behind it. I could feel the air shift, like something was moving. The voice in the static continued, "He listens to you. He listens to your voice. He listens to your fear." I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out. I felt like I was trapped in my own body. The voice in the static spoke again, "He is hungry." I felt my stomach drop. The voice continued, "He wants your voice. He wants your story." I shook my head, tears forming in my eyes. "No." The voice in the static laughed softly again. "Yes." I could feel the static growing louder, like it was building up to something. The sound filled the room, filling every corner, filling every part of me. The voice in the static spoke, "Tell them what happened." I felt my body move, even though I didn't want it to. I felt my mouth open. I felt myself begin to speak. But the words that came out were not mine. The voice in the static was speaking through me. It said, "The woman from the diner was not taken by a stranger." I swallowed hard, trying to stop the words, but they kept coming. "The town took her," the voice said. "The station took her." I felt my hands shaking. I felt my mind trying to fight, trying to push the voice away. But the voice in the static continued, "She is in the air. She is in the sound. She is in the static." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was moving, but the voice was not mine. The voice said, "She is listening." I felt tears streaming down my face. I felt the room spinning. The voice in the static continued, "You are listening too." The static grew louder. The voice said, "You can't leave." I felt a cold wave wash over me. I felt the fear take over. The voice in the static spoke again, "You belong to the night shift now." I tried to pull the headset off, but my hands wouldn't move. It was like something was holding them, like something was controlling me. The voice continued, "You will keep the station alive." I felt my body begin to speak again. The voice said, "You will tell the stories." The static filled the room completely. It was so loud that it felt like it was pressing against my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the static stopped. The room was silent. The lights were steady. The clock on the wall ticked normally. I sat there breathing hard, my hands shaking. I looked at the microphone, the headset, the mixing board. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know if I had imagined it. But I knew one thing. The voice in the static was real. And it was using me. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Who are you?" The room stayed silent. But in the quiet, I could still feel the presence of the voice, like it was waiting for me to speak again. I realized then that the static wasn't just a door. It was a mirror. And the voice in the static was not just me. It was what I would become. The studio door had never felt like a real door to me. It was more like a boundary, a line between the world I knew and the world I was slowly being pulled into. I had always assumed it was just old, just worn out, just a normal piece of a building that had been standing too long. But that night, the door became something else. It became a wall. I arrived at WBRK later than usual because I had been thinking about the tape I found. The lost broadcast, the voice in the static, the silent callers. Everything had started to feel like a pattern, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. I walked into the studio, the lights dim as always. The air smelled like dust and old electronics. The equipment sat in its usual places, the microphones like quiet, waiting mouths. I sat down at the desk and started the shift. I tried to focus on the work, on the routine. I tried to pretend the station was just a job. But the station wasn't a job. It was a trap. At 1:45 a.m., I heard a sound behind me, a soft click like a lock turning. I turned around slowly. The studio door was closed. It had been closed when I walked in, but I had never paid much attention. The door had always been there, always closed, always just a door. But now I felt a strange sense of unease. I walked toward it and tried the handle. It didn't move. I tried again. Still locked. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no sound of anyone outside. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. Maybe the lock was just stuck. Maybe the door was old. Maybe it was nothing. I walked back to the desk and sat down. I looked at the equipment, the mixing board, the tape player, the speakers. Everything seemed normal. But then the speakers crackled. A sound came through. Not the usual static. Not a whisper. A voice. My voice. But not the voice I had been using on air. This was different. This was the voice I used when I was alone. The voice I used when I was thinking. The voice I used when I didn't want anyone to hear me. The voice in the speaker said, "I can't leave." I froze. I stared at the speakers, my heart pounding. The voice continued, "I don't know how long I've been here." My skin went cold. The voice in the speakers sounded like it was coming from inside my head, like it was speaking from the place where my thoughts live. I whispered, "What is this?" The voice continued, "The door is locked." I swallowed hard. I know. The voice said, "I tried to leave. I tried to go home. I tried to tell someone." The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. I felt like I was being squeezed. The voice in the speakers continued, "But the station doesn't let you go." I looked at the door again, feeling the panic rise. I tried the handle again, but it still didn't move. The voice in the speakers spoke again. I can hear the silent callers. My hands shook. What do they want? The voice in the speakers answered, "They want someone to listen. They want someone to speak. They want someone to keep the station alive." I felt a cold wave wash over me. The voice continued, "They are not just listeners. They are part of the station." I stared at the equipment, feeling a growing sense of dread. I had always thought the station was just broadcasting to the town. I had always thought the station was a tool, a machine. But now I realized the station was more than that. The station was alive. It was feeding. It was hungry. The voice in the speakers continued, "I remember my life." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The voice said, "I remember everything. The way I used to walk, the way I used to talk, the way I used to think." I felt my stomach drop. The voice continued, "I remember the first time I came here." My breath caught. The voice said, "I remember the first night shift." The voice in the speakers began to speak faster, as if it was trying to get the words out before something stopped it. "I remember the way the town looked," the voice said. "I remember the way the streetlights flickered. I remember the way the air smelled. I remember the way I felt when I first heard the static." I stared at the speakers, feeling like I was watching myself from the outside. The voice continued, "I remember my mother's voice. I remember the sound of my father's footsteps. I remember the way my sister used to laugh." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The voice in the speaker spoke again. "I remember the day I left home." I felt tears well up in my eyes. I didn't want to hear this. I didn't want to listen to my own life being played back to me like a tape. But the voice continued. "I remember the job interview," it said. "I remember the way the man behind the desk looked at me. I remember the way he said, 'We only broadcast at midnight.' I remember the way he said, 'You will be the voice.'" I felt my hands clench into fists. The voice continued, "I remember the first call, the silent caller, the one who said, 'I'm in the river.' I remember the way I felt when I heard the whispering." I swallowed hard. "Stop," I whispered, "please stop." The voice in the speakers didn't stop. It continued, calm and steady. "I remember the tape," the voice said. "The lost broadcast, the message, the warning." I felt my heart drop. The voice continued, "I remember the moment the door locked." My breath caught. The voice said, "I remember the moment I realized I was trapped." The room felt colder. The air felt thicker. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The voice in the speakers spoke again. "I remember my name." My stomach dropped. I didn't want to hear my name. I didn't want the station to know my name. I didn't want to be seen. But the voice continued, "I remember my name, and I remember the moment I said it out loud." I felt my hands shaking. I felt my mouth go dry. The voice in the speakers whispered, "Say it." I stared at the microphone, my heart pounding. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to give the station any more power. But the voice in the speakers was not asking. It was commanding. It said, "Say it." My throat tightened. I tried to resist. I tried to keep my name inside me like a secret. But the station had already heard it. The voice in the speakers continued, "You said it the first night. You said it without knowing. You said it because you were tired. You said it because you thought no one was listening." I felt my breath catch. The voice in the speakers whispered, "You said your name." I felt my body tremble. I felt the fear rise up inside me like a wave. I realized then that the station didn't need me to speak my name. It only needed me to remember it. It only needed me to think it. It only needed me to know that it was there. The voice in the speakers continued, "You are not alone." I looked at the door again, feeling the panic rise. I tried to force my hands to move, to break the lock, to do anything. But my hands wouldn't move. It was like the door was holding me in place. The voice in the speaker spoke again. "The station is listening. The station is always listening." I sat there, frozen, as the equipment continued to play recordings of my life. My memories, my thoughts, my fears, all spilling out through the speakers like a river. I realized then that the station didn't just broadcast. It recorded. It recorded everything. It recorded my life. It recorded my mind. And now it was using it. The door stayed locked. The station kept playing. And I sat there, listening to myself, feeling like I was disappearing into the sound. The thing about a trap is that it never looks like a trap at first. It looks like a job. It looks like a quiet room. It looks like a routine you can fall into and forget. It looks like something harmless you can do to pass the night. WBRK looked like that. A small-town radio station with an old sign on the front, a dusty parking lot, and a blinking red light above the studio door that always seemed to glow just a little too warmly. I had started to think of it as a place that needed me, like I was helping it stay alive. But the truth was darker. The truth was that the station didn't need me. It needed my voice. It needed my attention. It needed my listening. And it was hungry. By the time I realized it, I had already been inside the trap for weeks. I had already been listening to the silent callers. I had already heard the voice in the static. I had already found the lost tape. I had already started to feel the station pressing its weight into my thoughts. I thought I was the one doing the job. But the job was doing me. That night I walked into the studio with the same slow steps I had used every night. The lights were dim. The air was stale. The equipment sat like old bones, waiting. I sat down at the desk and turned on the mic. The sound of my own breathing filled the room for a moment, loud and sharp. Then the silence returned, thick and heavy. I started the broadcast like I always did. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady. "This is WBRK broadcasting at midnight. If you're listening, you're not alone." I paused because the pause was part of the ritual. The pause was the moment where the station listened back. Then I continued. "I'm here," I said. "I'm here with you." The speakers crackled. The air shifted. And then I heard something that made my skin go cold. It wasn't a caller. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't static. It was my own voice, speaking through the station but not from the mic. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. It sounded like it was coming from inside my head. The voice said softly, "You're still here." I swallowed hard. "Yes," I said, but my voice sounded thin. "I'm still here." The voice in the wall said, "Good." I felt the fear rise slow and steady, like a tide. I tried to focus on the broadcast. I tried to act normal. I tried to keep my voice calm. But the station didn't want calm. The station wanted attention. The station wanted me to stay awake. The station wanted me to listen. I heard a sound behind me, a faint click, like a door closing. I turned my head slowly. The studio door was closed. I knew it was closed. But now I felt it differently. I felt the door like a barrier, like a line I could not cross. I looked at the lock. It was a simple lock, old and worn. But the lock looked newer now, like it had been oiled, like it had been used. I stood up and walked to the door. I tried the handle. It didn't move. I pressed my ear to the door. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no sound of someone outside. Just the quiet. Just the station. I walked back to the desk, my heart pounding. I sat down and stared at the equipment, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then the speakers crackled again. The voice in the walls spoke, but this time it wasn't my voice. It was a different voice. A voice that sounded like a person who had been whispering for years. It said, "We're listening." I felt my stomach drop. I whispered, "Who are you?" The voice answered, "We are the ones who stayed." I froze. The ones who stayed. The ones who never left. The ones who never got out. I remembered the silent callers. I remembered the lost tape. I remembered the voice in the static. I remembered the feeling of being watched. I realized then that the station wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by people. Not people who died. People who were trapped. People who had been listening too long. People who had become part of the station. The voice in the walls continued, "You can't leave." I felt a cold wave wash over me. "Why?" I whispered. The voice said, "Because you're listening." I stared at the microphone, feeling the panic rise. I had been thinking about the station like it was a place. Like it was a building. Like it was a job. But the station was not a place. It was a system. A machine that fed on voices. A machine that fed on attention. A machine that fed on listening. I whispered, "I don't understand." The voice in the walls said, "It's simple." The voice continued, "You listen and we feed. You speak and we grow." I felt my throat tighten. "So I'm the food?" The voice answered, "No." The voice paused, like it was savoring the moment. Then it said, "You are the harvest." I sat there, feeling the words settle in my mind like a weight. I thought about the callers, the ones who whispered but never gave their names, the ones who described someone watching them, the ones who sounded like they were speaking from inside a hole. I thought about the tape, the broadcast that never aired, the voice that sounded like mine but wasn't mine. I thought about the lost nights, the nights I had spent alone in the studio, feeling like I was being watched. And I realized the truth. The station wasn't broadcasting to the town. The station was broadcasting to something else. Something that was listening back. Something that was waiting. The voice in the walls spoke again. "You can try to leave." I whispered, "I will try." The voice said, "You can't." I felt my hands shake. "Why not?" The voice said, "Because you are already inside." I stared at the equipment, feeling like I was sinking. The speakers crackled, and the sound of my own voice filled the room again. But this time, it wasn't me speaking. It was the station speaking through me. It was my voice, but it sounded different. It sounded empty. It sounded like it had been hollowed out. The station spoke through me, saying, "If you're listening, you're not alone." I felt tears sting my eyes. I tried to speak, to take back my voice, but my mouth wouldn't move. The station was using me. The station was using my voice to call more listeners. To feed. To grow. I felt a strange, sickening realization. The station didn't just trap voices. It trapped listeners. It trapped people who stayed too long. It trapped anyone who thought they could help. Anyone who thought they could just listen. Anyone who thought they could be safe. I sat there paralyzed as the station continued to play. Not music. Not news. Not stories. Just voices. My voice. Other voices. Whispers. Breathing. Memories. The sound of people trying to escape. The sound of people giving up. The sound of the station feeding. I heard my own voice again, coming from the speakers, but this time it sounded like it was far away. It said, "I can't leave." I felt my chest tighten. The voice in the walls whispered, "Good." The station continued to play. And I realized with a slow, sinking dread that the last broadcast wasn't a show. It was a trap. And I was the final guest. The first time I saw the train, it was already too close. I was standing at the crossing, the little booth I worked in, feeling smaller than it looked on paper. The night air was cold, and the only light came from a single street lamp that flickered like it was struggling to stay awake. Beyond the crossing, the tracks cut through the darkness like a line drawn with a ruler, straight and endless. My job was simple. I watched the signals. I made sure the crossing gates came down when a train was coming. I pressed the button that warned drivers to stop. I listened for the distant rumble that meant a train was near. And then I waited. The town behind me was quiet. The town in front of me was empty. It felt like the world had been paused, like someone had hit the stop button on life and forgotten to press play again. I had taken this job because I needed the money, because the nights were slow, because it felt safe in a strange way, sitting alone with the tracks in the dark. I told myself I could handle the loneliness. I told myself I could handle the silence. But that night, the silence felt different. It felt like it was waiting. The first train I saw was a long one, the kind that stretched out like a snake. It came without warning, its lights cutting through the dark like two bright eyes. The crossing bells started to ring, loud and sharp, and the gates began to lower with a slow, heavy thud. I pressed the button to stop traffic. I watched the cars pull back. I watched the people inside their cars look at me, confused, like they didn't know why the gates were coming down. And then the train passed. It was normal. It was exactly what it should have been. The moment it went by, the bells stopped. The gates lifted. The night returned to its quiet. I exhaled, feeling foolish for being tense. I told myself it was just a train. I told myself it was nothing. Then about an hour later, I saw it again. The same train. The same lights. The same slow rumble. Only this time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A man was standing by the side of the road, waving his arms. He was trying to get the train to stop. He was shouting, but I couldn't hear the words. He was waving like someone who was desperate. The crossing bells rang. The gates lowered. The man kept waving. The train got closer. The man's face was pale in the light of the train's headlamps. His eyes were wide. His mouth was open. He was screaming. And the train didn't slow down. It didn't even seem to notice him. It just kept moving, its lights cutting through the night, the sound of its wheels a constant roar. The man's arms dropped. His body went still. The train passed him by, as if he wasn't there. I stood in the booth, frozen, watching the man disappear into the darkness. I wanted to run out and check on him. I wanted to see if he was okay. I wanted to see if he had fallen or if he was hurt. But the train was gone. And the man was gone. The night was quiet again. I told myself it was a trick of the light. I told myself the man had stepped back. I told myself I had imagined it. But the feeling stayed. A cold, heavy feeling in my chest, like something had pressed its hand against my heart and wouldn't let go. I tried to shake it off. I tried to focus on the work. I checked the signals. I checked the gates. I checked the cameras. Everything was normal. But the normal felt wrong. Later that night, I saw the train again. This time there were two people standing by the tracks, a woman and a child. The woman was holding the child's hand tightly, like she was trying to keep them from being pulled away by the wind. They were waving. They were shouting. The child was crying. The train came closer. The crossing bells rang. The gates lowered. The train didn't stop. It didn't slow. It didn't even blink. The woman's face was twisted in fear. The child's face was wet with tears. The train passed them by, and for a moment it felt like the air itself was shaking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out and grab them. I wanted to pull them away from the tracks. But the train was gone, and the woman and child were gone. Just like the man. I sat in the booth, my hands trembling on the desk. I stared at the monitor, the screen showing the empty road and the empty tracks. I watched the crossing gates slowly lift back up. The night returned. The silence returned. And I realized something that made my stomach drop. The train was coming more often. It was coming every hour now, like clockwork. And each time there was someone standing by the tracks, waving, shouting, begging for the train to stop. And each time the train ignored them. It didn't slow down. It didn't even acknowledge them. It just kept going, as if it had a schedule it couldn't break. as if it had a job to do, as if it didn't care about the people standing in its path. I started to keep track of the times. I wrote them down in a notebook because I needed something to hold onto that felt real. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. 11:03 p.m. 12:03 a.m. 1:03 a.m. 2:03 a.m. The train came every hour on the hour. And each time there was someone waiting. Each time someone waving. Each time someone hopping. And each time the train passed them like they were invisible. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. I tried to tell myself the people were all different. I tried to tell myself I was seeing things. But the truth was, they all looked the same. Not the same person, but the same expression. The same desperation. The same fear. It was like the train was taking something from them. Like it was taking their hope. Like it was taking their last chance. And the worst part was, I felt like I was part of it. Like I was helping. Like I was watching something happen and doing nothing. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I waited for the train to come, and when I saw the lights in the distance, I ran out of the booth. I ran to the edge of the road, to the tracks, to where the people always stood. There was a woman there. She was older than the others. Her hair was long and gray. She held a small suitcase in her hand. She was waving, but her waving looked tired, like she had been doing it for hours. I shouted, "Hey, wait." She turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were blank, like she was staring through me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I reached out, but I didn't move fast enough. The train came. The bells rang. The gates dropped. The woman kept waving. The train passed. I felt the air rush past me like a wall of wind. The sound of the train filled my ears, loud and overwhelming. When it was gone, the woman was still there. She was still waving. But she wasn't waving at the train anymore. She was waving at me. And then she looked right through me. As if I wasn't there. As if I was invisible. I stood there shaking, watching her fade into the dark. I went back to the booth and sat down, my heart pounding. I stared at the notebook on the desk. I stared at the times I had written down. 3:03 a.m. The train would come again. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to save them. All I knew was that the train kept coming. And the people kept waiting. And I kept watching. The next night, I decided to do something different. I stayed in the booth, but I didn't watch the monitors. I didn't check the signals. I didn't press the button. I just listened. I listened to the quiet. I listened to the darkness. I listened for the train. And when the train came, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of the wheels. It wasn't the roar of the engine. It was a voice that came from the tracks, from the distance, from the night itself. A voice that sounded like a conductor. A voice that sounded like a man who had been speaking for years. It said calmly, "No one stops the train." The voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was simply sure. It was simply certain. It was simply normal. Like it was a rule. Like it was a law. Like it was the way things were meant to be. I whispered, "Why?" The voice answered, "Because the train doesn't stop for anyone." I felt the dread rise. Because I knew then that the train wasn't just a train. It was a force. It was a habit. It was a machine that couldn't be stopped. And I realized something else. I realized that the people waving weren't trying to stop the train. They were trying to be seen. They were trying to be noticed. They were trying to be remembered. They were trying to make the train acknowledge them, even for a moment. Even if it meant being ignored. even if it meant being passed by. Because if the train passed them, it meant they existed. It meant they had a story. It meant they mattered. And the train didn't care. The train just kept moving. The voice in the night said, "You're still here." I swallowed hard. "I'm still here," I whispered. The voice answered, "Good." And the train came again. I watched it pass. I watched the lights disappear. I watched the darkness swallow the tracks. And I understood something I didn't want to understand. The train wasn't stopping. Not because it couldn't, but because it wouldn't. Not because it was broken, but because it was waiting. Waiting for someone to stop watching. Waiting for someone to stop listening. Waiting for someone to stop caring. Waiting for someone like me. Because the train didn't just run on tracks. It ran on attention. And I had given it mine. I sat in the booth alone as the night stretched on. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. The silence pressed in. And I realized that the train would come again. And again. And again. Until I stopped being the one who watched. Until I stopped being the one who listened. Until I stopped being the one who believed I could make a difference. Because the train didn't stop for anyone. And it never would. Under the tracks, the air was colder. I had expected dampness, of course. Old trains, old rails, old places like this. I expected the smell of rust and wet stone. But what I didn't expect was how quiet it felt, like the world above had been muted. The only sound was my own breathing and the small crunch of gravel under my boots. The first time I went under the tracks, I told myself it was just curiosity. I told myself I was being a journalist, doing a story. I told myself I was just looking for a place to hide from the wind. But I knew, even then, that curiosity was only part of it. There was something about that stretch of rail that felt wrong. It wasn't the trains. The trains were loud, and loud things are easy to understand. It was the quiet between them, the way the darkness seemed to sit there, waiting. I found the entrance by accident. I was following the tracks, looking for the spot where the land dipped under the rails. The crossing was far behind me. The town was even farther. The only light was the moon, but it was bright enough to show the outline of a narrow gap in the earth. It looked like a tunnel. It looked like a place that shouldn't be there. I hesitated. Then I climbed down. The air was damp and cold, and the ground was uneven. The tunnel was narrow, just wide enough for one person to move through. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment I felt like I was the only person in the world. Then I saw the first stone. It wasn't a big stone. It wasn't a fancy monument. It was just a rough piece of rock with a name carved into it. The name was simple. No dates. No message. Just a name. I stepped closer. The stone was half buried in dirt, and the carving was worn, like it had been there for a long time. I wiped the dirt away with my sleeve. The name was clear now. I felt my throat tighten. It was the same name I had seen on the train crossing schedule. The same name I had heard on the radio. The same name I had seen written in the notebook. It was the name of the man who had been waving at the train. His name was carved into the stone. I looked around. There were more stones, more names, more simple carvings, worn by time and damp air. None of them had dates. None of them had messages. Just names. I felt a strange pull, like the stones were calling to me. I moved deeper into the tunnel. The space widened and the air grew colder. The walls were rough and the ground was uneven. The flashlight beam revealed more stones, each one placed carefully, like someone had arranged them. I started to count. 1, 2, 3. It was hard to keep track. There were so many. And the deeper I went, the more I realized something that made my skin crawl. The stones weren't random. They were arranged in rows, like a graveyard, a real graveyard. But it was hidden under the tracks. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't in any record. It wasn't supposed to exist. I stopped walking. I stood still and listened. The silence was thick. It was so quiet that I could hear the small sound of my own heartbeat. I felt like I was intruding, like I was somewhere I didn't belong. I looked at the stones again. Some of them had names I recognized. Some of them had names I didn't. Some of them had names that made my stomach drop, because they were names of people who were still alive, people who lived in the town, people I had seen walking around, people I had seen in the grocery store, people I had seen at the diner. I felt my hands shake. I tried to tell myself it was a trick. I tried to tell myself I was reading the names wrong. But the letters were clear, and the names were real. I backed away slowly, my flashlight beam moving over the stones. I felt like I was being watched, even though I knew I was. Then I saw something that made my breath catch. There was a small marker near the center of the graveyard. It was different from the others. It wasn't a stone. It was a wooden board, old and rotted, with a name painted on it in faded black letters. The paint was flacking, but the name was still readable. It was the name of the woman I had seen with the child. I stared at it for a long time, unable to move. The idea that she could be here under the tracks made my stomach turn. I had watched her wave. I had watched her cry. I had watched her be ignored. And now her name was carved into a board, as if she had been placed here like a piece of lost luggage. I felt a strange anger rise in me. Anger at the train. Anger at the town. Anger at myself for not doing anything. I wanted to run out of the tunnel. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell someone. But the tunnel was quiet, and the quiet felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I took a step forward. The ground under my boot shifted. I looked down. There was a small gap in the earth, like a shallow hole. I crouched and shone my light into it. The light revealed a small object. A piece of cloth. It looked like it had been torn. It looked like it had been buried. I reached down and touched it. The cloth was cold. It was damp. It smelled like earth. I pulled it out. It was a small piece of a child's shirt. A piece of fabric with a tiny pattern. I held it in my hand, and I felt a wave of nausea. I remembered the child I had seen. I remembered the child's face. I remembered the child's tears. I remembered the child's fear. I put the cloth back in the hole and stood up. My flashlight beam moved over the stones again. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were small objects placed on some of the graves. A toy car, a small doll, a crayon, a broken pencil, a child's shoe. Each object looked old, like it had been there for a long time. Like someone had placed them carefully. Like someone had visited. Like someone had remembered. I felt a strange sadness, and it made me feel even more sick. Because I realized something else. The people who were buried here weren't just the ones who had been ignored by the train. They were the ones who had been forgotten by the town. They were the ones who had been erased. They were the ones who had been placed under the tracks, out of sight, out of mind. I walked deeper into the graveyard, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. The air grew colder, and the stones seemed to get closer together. The tunnel felt like it was closing in. I reached the far end of the graveyard. There was a larger stone there, a bigger marker, as if it belonged to someone important. The stone was plain, but the name was carved deeply. The letters were fresh, not worn like the others. It looked like it had been carved recently. I stepped closer. The name on the stone made my blood run cold. It was my name. My full name. My date of birth was carved beneath it. My name carved into a stone under the tracks. I felt my knees go weak. I leaned against the wall of the tunnel, my breathing shallow. I stared at the stone. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake. I tried to tell myself someone had played a cruel prank. But the stone looked real. The carving looked real. The date looked real. And the fact that it was here, in this hidden graveyard, made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the stone. I felt like I was being pulled. Like the graveyard was calling me. Like it wanted me to stay. I turned and ran. I ran through the tunnel, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I didn't stop until I was back in the open air, under the moonlight. I stood there gasping, my heart pounding. The town was quiet. The tracks were quiet. The air was cold. I looked back at the entrance to the tunnel, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move inside. But it was just my imagination. Or maybe it was. I don't know. All I know is that the graveyard under the tracks is real. And it isn't on any map. And the names carved into the stones are real. And the most terrifying part is this. I don't know who put them there. I don't know why. I don't know how. And I don't know if the train is the one doing it. Or if the train is just the thing that brings them. But I do know this. Every time the train comes, it feels like the earth is trying to remember something. And every time I hear it, I feel like I am being pulled back down into the darkness. Because the graveyard under the tracks is not just hidden. It is waiting. The first time I went back, I told myself I was just checking. I told myself I needed to be sure. But I knew that wasn't true. I wanted to go back because I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about the graveyard under the tracks. I couldn't stop thinking about the names carved into the stones. I couldn't stop thinking about my own name, staring at me from the darkness. I wanted to understand. And I wanted to be sure it was real. So I went back. This time I brought a camera. I brought a notebook. I brought a flashlight with fresh batteries. I brought everything I thought I might need. I walked to the spot where the entrance was, and I felt my stomach twist. The moon was higher in the sky, and the air was colder. The town behind me was quiet. The tracks in front of me looked like a line of metal cutting through the earth. I hesitated. Then I climbed down. The tunnel was darker than I remembered. The walls seemed closer. The air felt thicker. My flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand. I moved slowly, step by step, the way you move when you don't want to wake something. I passed the first few stones. The names were still there, worn and old. The carvings looked faded, but they were still readable. I felt a strange relief. At least some of it was real. At least some of it was old. At least some of it had been there for a long time. But when I got deeper, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The stones in the center of the graveyard looked different. They were newer. They were cleaner. They looked like they had been placed there recently. The names on them were carved deep, as if someone had used fresh tools. And the letters were sharp, not worn. I moved closer. I felt like my feet were heavy, like the ground was pulling me down. I shone my flashlight on the nearest stone. The name was clear. It was a name I didn't recognize. A name I hadn't seen before. It looked fresh. It looked like it had been carved yesterday. I stared at it for a long time. Then I moved to the next stone. The same. Fresh. New. Sharp letters. I looked at the next stone. And the next. Every stone in that center area had a name carved into it that looked new, like someone had just finished writing it. But the strange thing was that the names weren't random. They were all names of people from the town. People I had seen. People I had met. People I had spoken to. The names were written in the same style, the same hand, like one person had carved them all. And the more I looked, the more I realized something that made my skin crawl. The names were not just names. They were the names of people who had gone missing. The names of people who had vanished without a trace. The names of people who were supposed to be alive, somewhere in the town, but who had not been seen for months, maybe years. I felt my heart pound. I felt a wave of nausea. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. I tried to tell myself the names were common. I tried to tell myself I was reading too much into it. But the names were too specific, too familiar, too real. I took out my notebook and started writing down the names. One by one, slowly, carefully. The flashlight beam shook slightly as my hand trembled. I wrote down the first name, then the second, then the third. I looked at the names and I realized something else. The names were in the order of the train schedule. The names were listed like a timetable, like a list of passengers, like a list of people who were supposed to be on the train. I stared at the stone again. I could almost see the letters moving, like the names were alive, like they were waiting to be read. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I looked around. The graveyard was quiet. The silence felt heavier than before. It felt like the air itself was listening. I moved to the far end of the graveyard, where the large stone with my name was. The stone was still there. The carving was still fresh. But now I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were new names carved beneath mine. Small names, like they had been added later. Names that looked like they were written in a different hand. Names that looked like they were carved by someone else. I leaned closer. I read them. The names were familiar. Too familiar. They were the names of the people who had been waving at the train. The man, the woman, the child. The names were all there. And beneath them, in smaller letters, was another name. A name I didn't recognize. A name that wasn't on any missing persons list. A name that didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was written in the same style as the fresh names. It was carved deeply, like it was meant to stay. The name was simple. It was a word. Not a name, really. A word that made my stomach drop. Listener. I stared at it for a long time. I felt my mouth go dry. I felt like I was being watched. I felt like the graveyard was telling me something. I looked around again. I noticed something else. There were scratches on the stones. Small marks, like someone had been running their fingernails over the letters. Like someone had been touching the names. Like someone had been reading them over and over. I moved closer to one of the newer stones. I placed my hand on it. The stone was cold. The carving was sharp. I felt a strange pull, like the stone was drawing me in. I pulled my hand away quickly. My heart was racing. I turned and walked back toward the entrance. But as I walked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The names on the stones were changing. Not in a dramatic way. Not like the letters were moving. But in a slow, subtle way, like the carvings were being refreshed. Like someone was recarving them. Like someone was keeping them sharp. I stopped walking. I stared at the stone. I watched the letters. And I realized that the names were not just fresh. They were being kept fresh. As if someone wanted them to look new. as if someone wanted the names to stay visible, as if someone wanted the people to be remembered, or maybe as if someone wanted the people to stay trapped. I felt a cold fear settle in my chest. I realized then that the graveyard wasn't just hidden. It was alive. Not alive in a normal way. Alive in a way that made no sense. Alive in a way that felt like it was watching me. I hurried out of the tunnel, my flashlight beam shaking. I climbed up and out into the night. The air felt warmer. The town looked normal. The tracks looked normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something had noticed me. Something had marked me. Because when I got back to the booth, I checked the notebook again. And the last name on the list had changed. It wasn't the same name I had written. It wasn't any name I recognized. It was a new name. A name carved into the page, as if someone had written it there without my hand. And it was written in the same style as the stones. The same sharp letters. The same deep carving. The name was simple, and it made my blood run cold. It was my name. And beneath it, in smaller letters like a whisper, was the word. I found the ledger the way you find things you don't want to find. It was hidden in the station office, tucked behind a stack of old timetables and broken paperwork. The office itself felt like it had not been touched in years. Dust sat on everything like a thin layer of ash. The air smelled like old paper and cold metal. I had been there before, of course. I'd been working the night shift long enough to know where the station's secrets hid. But this time, I was looking for something specific. I had been thinking about the graveyard under the tracks. I had been thinking about the names carved in rust. I had been thinking about the way the train kept coming, and the way the people kept waiting. I needed proof. I needed something that would make sense of it all. I pulled open the office door and stepped inside. The light from my flashlight made the room feel smaller. The shadows seemed to move with the beam, like they were trying to hide. I walked to the desk and started sorting through the old papers. There were schedules, maintenance logs, and a few notebooks. Most of them were boring. Most of them were normal. Then I found the ledger. It was thick with a leather cover that looked worn. The edges were frayed like it had been handled a lot. It didn't look like the kind of ledger you would use for a small station. It looked older. It looked important. I opened it. The pages were filled with names. Not just names, names and dates, names and times. The first page had a title written in neat handwriting. Passenger list, MISSED train. I felt my stomach tighten. I flipped through the pages slowly. Each page had names, one after another, written in the same careful hand. The names were grouped by date. The dates were recent. The dates were within the last few months. I read the first page. The names were familiar. I recognized a few of them from the town. I recognized the names of people who had been missing for a long time. I recognized the names of people I had seen standing by the tracks, waving at the train. The names were all there. And next to each name, there was a time that matched the train schedule. 11:03 p.m., 12:03 a.m., 1:03 a.m., 2:03 a.m. The same times, the same hours, the same train. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I kept flipping. The ledger went on and on. The pages were full. There were names on every page. There were names from the town, names I had never heard, names that made my stomach twist. And then I saw something that made my breath catch. Some of the names had notes next to them. Not dates, not times. Notes, small words written in the same careful hand. Words like, no show, not found, left early, not ONBOARD. I stared at the words. I read them again. The notes were written like a report, like someone was keeping track of people who didn't show up, like someone was expecting them, like someone was disappointed they didn't come. I flipped further, and then I saw the page that made my hands go cold. The page had a date that was not in the past, a date that was tomorrow, and the names on that page were the names of people I knew, the names of people who lived in the town, the names of people I had spoken to in the grocery store, the names of people I had seen at the diner, the names of people I had seen in the town square. And next to each name was the same note. MISSED train. I felt my throat tighten. I closed the ledger quickly, like I could shut the truth away. But the truth didn't go away. It sat there in my hands, heavy and real. I sat down at the desk and tried to steady my breathing. I thought about the people who had been waving at the train. I thought about the graveyard under the tracks. I thought about the names carved in rust. I thought about the way the train kept coming. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. The ledger was not a record of people who missed the train. It was a list of people who were supposed to miss it. It was a list of people the train expected. It was a list of people the train wanted. I opened the ledger again, and this time I looked closer. I noticed that some of the names were written in a different ink, the same handwriting but different ink, like someone had added them later. I flipped back to the first pages. I found a name that I recognized. It was the name of the man I had seen waving at the train. Next to his name was a note. MISSED train. Then I found the name of the woman. Next to her name was the same note. Then the child. The same note. And then I found my name. My name was there, written in the same careful hand. And next to it was a note that made my heart stop. "On board." I stared at the words for a long time. I read them again. "On board." It didn't make sense. I wasn't on the train. I had never been on the train. I had never even seen the inside of the train. But the ledger said I was on board. I felt a cold fear rise in me. I felt like the room was closing in. I closed the ledger again, my hands shaking. I stood up and walked to the window. The station was dark outside. The tracks were dark. The town was dark. I stared out at the empty road. I tried to tell myself it was just a mistake. I tried to tell myself someone had made a prank. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the ledger was real. That the names were real. That the train was real. And that the train was waiting. I went back to the desk and opened the ledger one more time. I flipped to the page with my name. I stared at the words. "On board." I thought about the graveyard under the tracks. I thought about the names carved in rust. I thought about the way the train kept coming. And I realized something that made my skin crawl. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was a plan. A list of who the train would take next. A list of who would be missing tomorrow. A list of who would be forgotten. I closed the ledger and put it back where I found it. I didn't want to touch it again. I didn't want to look at it again. But I knew I would. Because the train was coming. And the train was not just a train. It was a machine that was feeding on the town. And I was on the list. The first time I heard the rails whisper, I thought it was the wind. I was standing on the platform, watching the dark line of the tracks disappear into the trees. The night was quiet in that kind of way that feels like a held breath. Even the crickets seemed to be listening. I had been working the night shift for weeks, and I had learned to read the silence. Silence in a train station is not empty. It's full of old sounds. It's full of echoes. It's full of the memory of things that happened there before. That night the silence felt thick. I was leaning on the railing, trying to keep my eyes open when I heard it. A soft sound, like a voice carried through metal. At first I thought it was the train approaching, but there was no light, no distant rumble, just the sound like a whisper moving along the rails. I stood still. I listened. The whisper came again, and this time I could make out words. Not a full sentence, not a voice I recognized, just a name. It was faint, like someone was speaking from far away. But the name was clear. Lena. I froze. Lena was a woman from the town. She had been missing for months. People had searched. People had posted flyers. People had said her name like a prayer. I had never met her. I had only seen her once at the diner when she was still there. The name on the rails felt like a warning. I waited, and the whisper came again. Lena. And then another name. Mark. I knew Mark. He was the guy who fixed the water pipes. He was always tired, always quiet. He had been missing for weeks. I felt my heart beat faster. The whisper kept going. It was like the rails were speaking the names of people the town had lost. One by one. Like a list. Like a chant. I stepped closer to the tracks. The metal looked black under the moonlight. The rails were cold and shiny. They stretched out into the darkness like a path that led nowhere. The whisper came again, and this time it was clearer. Lena. Mark. Sarah. Tom. Each name sounded like it was being pulled out of the metal itself. Like the rails were remembering them. I backed away slowly, my skin prickling. I wanted to tell myself it was my mind playing tricks. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind. I wanted to tell myself I was tired. But the whisper kept going. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. My own name. At first, I didn't believe it. I thought I must have imagined it. But the whisper said it again. And again. And each time it sounded closer. It sounded like it was coming from the rails right beneath my feet. It sounded like the metal was speaking to me. Like it knew me. Like it had been waiting for me to hear it. I stood there unable to move. The whisper was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't just saying my name. It was saying my name like it belonged to someone else. Like it was a word the rails had learned. Like it was a sound they had been practicing. I tried to step away, but my feet felt heavy. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick. The whisper continued, and I realized it wasn't just names. It was the way the names were said. The whisper made them sound like they were being called. Like someone was calling out for them. Like someone was trying to bring them back. I looked down at the rails. The metal looked ordinary, but the sound coming from it was not ordinary. It was like the rails were alive. It was like they had a memory. I stood there listening, and I thought about the ledger. The passenger list. The names of people who had missed the train. The names that were not supposed to exist anymore. I thought about the graveyard under the tracks. The names carved in rust. The way the train never stopped. The way the town seemed to forget. And I realized something that made my throat tighten. The rails were whispering the names of the missing because they were still there. Because they were still in the tracks. Because the tracks had taken them. Because the tracks had kept them. I tried to tell myself it was impossible. But the whisper was too real. Too clear. Too close. I stepped back from the rails and walked toward the station. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I reached the station door and turned the handle. It was locked. I tried again. Locked. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. The whisper was louder now, like it had followed me. It was coming through the walls. It was coming through the floor. It was coming from everywhere. And it was saying my name. I put my hand on the door and leaned my forehead against it. I closed my eyes and tried to calm myself. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress, just the long nights, just the fear. But the whisper kept going. And then I heard something else. A different sound. A faint rhythm. A slow, steady beat. Like the sound of a train moving in the distance. But there was no train. No light. No rumble. Just the whisper and the rhythm. The rhythm sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like something alive. It sounded like the tracks themselves were breathing. I opened my eyes and looked out the station window. The tracks were empty, but the darkness beyond them seemed to move. Like something was walking along the rails. Like something was following the path. I felt my stomach drop. I felt a cold fear rise in me that was deeper than any fear I had felt before. Because I realized the whisper was not just a sound. It was a message, a warning, a call. The rails were calling the missing, and they were calling me. I stepped away from the window and turned back toward the office. I needed to find something, anything, a way to prove what I was hearing. I walked to the desk and opened the drawer. Inside was a small radio scanner. It was old, but it still worked. I turned it on and tuned it to the frequency I used for the night shift. Static filled the room, but beneath the static, I heard the whisper again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the rails. It was coming from the radio. It was coming from the station itself. The radio whispered the names, one after another. And then, in the middle of the static, I heard my name. It was not a whisper now. It was clear. It was close. It was like someone was speaking right into my ear. And I realized the worst part. The station was not just repeating the names. It was listening. It was recording. It was feeding on them. The names were being collected. Like the train collected the missing. Like the rails collected their memories. Like the station collected their voices. I turned off the radio. I sat down. I put my head in my hands. I tried to think. I tried to understand. I tried to remember what I had been told when I took the job. They had said the station was quiet. They had said it was safe. They had said the night shift was easy. They had not said the station listened. They had not said the station spoke. They had not said the station kept people. I sat there in the dark and I listened. The whisper was still there, faint, distant, like a voice traveling through a tunnel. It said a name, then another, and then finally it said mine. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the train was not the only thing that kept coming. The station did too. And it was not done with me yet. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was just tired. I had been working nights at the crossing for weeks, and the hours had started to blur together. The same dark road, the same empty fields, the same distant hum of the town that never quite woke up. It was the kind of place where time felt slow, like it was stuck in the same moment and refusing to move on. I was sitting in the small control booth, the one with the dusty window and the old switchboard. The light inside was weak, like it didn't want to be noticed. Outside, the night was black, but the moon was bright enough to cast thin shadows across the tracks. I watched the rails. I watched the line of metal disappear into the trees. I watched the darkness like it was a living thing. And I waited. I was waiting for the train. Or more accurately, I was waiting for the sound of it. The train always came at night, and it never stopped. That was the rule. That was the thing I had learned in the first days on the job. The conductor didn't stop, even when people waved. The train just kept going. But on this night, something felt different. The air felt heavy. The silence felt too deep, like the world had pressed down and held its breath. I leaned closer to the window. I saw the faint glow of the headlight in the distance. At first, I thought it was coming toward the crossing. But then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The light wasn't getting closer. It was moving in a circle. It was moving around the town. The train was circling. I watched it move like a slow predator, tracing the same path again and again, as if it was searching for something. The sound of the train came next. Not a roar, not a thunder, just a low, steady rumble that rolled through the ground. It was the sound of something heavy and old. It was the sound of something that had been here a long time. The train passed the crossing. It didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It just kept going, circling the town. And then, as it passed, I heard it. A faint voice. A whisper. It came from the tracks. It came from the train. It came from the air itself. The whisper sounded like a name. Like a call. Like someone speaking from inside the metal. I didn't recognize the name at first. Then I realized it was a name I had heard before. It was one of the names from the ledger. The names of people who had missed the train. People who had disappeared. People the town had forgotten. The whisper was saying the name softly, like a memory. Like a prayer. I felt my skin go cold. The train kept circling. The whisper kept coming. And then, for the first time, I understood. The train wasn't moving forward. It was moving in a loop. It was trapped in a circle. And it wasn't just circling the town. It was circling the people. It was circling the missing. It was circling me. I sat back in my chair, my heart beating hard. I tried to tell myself it was just the sound of the wind. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination. But the whisper kept coming, and the name kept repeating. It was not just a sound. It was a pattern, a rhythm, a calling. The train wasn't a train. It was a trap. It was a machine that moved in circles, collecting voices, collecting people, collecting the ones who listened too closely. I thought about the cemetery under the tracks. I thought about the gravestone with fresh names carved into rust. I thought about the ledger. I thought about the missing. I thought about the way the town looked at me like I was crazy when I asked questions. And I realized the truth was worse than I had feared. The train didn't just pass through the town. It owned the town. It owned the tracks. It owned the people who lived near it. It was not a vehicle. It was a predator. It was a loop. A circle that never ended. The train came around again. The headlight appeared in the distance like a star that didn't move. It approached the crossing, and the sound of it grew louder. I watched it pass, and as it did, I heard the whisper again. This time, it wasn't a name I recognized. This time, it was my own name. Not just said, but called, as if the train was reaching out, as if it was inviting me, as if it was waiting for me to answer. My hands trembled. I felt like I was going to be sick. I turned away from the window and stared at the control panel. The switches were old. The lights were dim. The booth felt like a small, fragile cage. I realized something else then. The train didn't need to stop to take someone. It didn't need to crash. It didn't need to run someone over. It just needed them to listen. It just needed them to hear the whisper. It just needed them to be close enough to the tracks. The train would do the rest. It would circle. It would call. It would collect. I tried to focus on something else. Anything else. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight, the hour when the town was supposed to be asleep, the hour when the train was supposed to be moving. I looked back out the window. The train was still circling. The headlight was still moving in a slow, steady path. The whisper was still coming, and the whisper was getting louder. It was like the train was learning my name, like it was practicing it, like it was preparing to use it. I tried to stand up. My legs felt weak. I tried to walk toward the door. The floor felt like it was swaying. I had to hold onto the desk to keep from falling. I opened the door. The night air hit me like a cold wave. The field beyond the booth was dark. The tracks were shining in the moonlight. The train was far away, but I could still hear it. I could still hear the whisper. It was coming from the rails like a voice buried in the ground. I walked down the path toward the tracks. My heart was pounding. My mind was racing. I knew I shouldn't go closer. I knew I should stay in the booth. But something pulled me. Something in the whisper. Something in the way it said my name. I reached the edge of the rails. I stood there, staring at the metal. The train's headlight appeared again in the distance. It moved in the same circle. It came closer. The whisper came louder. My name. My name again. I felt like I was being called into the darkness. I felt like the tracks were opening. I felt like the town was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the whisper changed. It stopped being a call. It became a sentence. A slow, quiet statement. It said, "You stayed." I froze. My mouth went dry. The words hit me like a blow. You stayed. I remembered then. The first night I came here. The first time I heard the train. The first time I felt the whisper. I remembered thinking I could leave. I remembered thinking I could walk away. I remembered thinking the town would be safe if I just did my job. But I hadn't left. I had stayed. I had stayed night after night. I had listened. I had let the whisper become part of me. And now the train was telling me the truth. It wasn't just collecting the missing. It was collecting the ones who stayed. The ones who listened. The ones who didn't walk away. The train wasn't a path forward. It was a path that went nowhere. It was a circle that kept turning. And the more you listened, the more you became part of it. The train passed again. The headlight moved away into the darkness. The whisper faded. The night grew quiet. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard the soft sound of the rails. A faint, distant whisper. A name. And I knew with a cold certainty that the train would keep circling. It would keep calling. It would keep collecting. And if I didn't leave soon, it would collect me too. Because the track did not lead anywhere. It only led in circles. And the circle was getting smaller.